Ryan was an ordinary young man. His high school sweetheart Jessica always at his side. In his early 20s, he already owns his own home. Last week he proposed to Jess, and she immediately said yes. The pair had a set of best friends they had known since high school, Shay and Blake. Blake was the jock, while Shay was the cheerleader. They always met up on Saturdays to get a few drinks in an attempt to not lose their friendship, as most high school friendships die. This Saturday was special because as kids they would always trick-or-treat together on Halloween, and it was in fact the 31st of October. Shay would always text Jess about Blake taking forever to get ready, but today there was no messages. In fact, Jess hadn't gotten a response hours prior to the meetup. Since Ryan and Jess met with them ritualistically, they assumed that they would show, and if not, they could at least spend some time with each other. Jess was getting ready in the shower while Ryan got his Sunday best on. Ryan called to the bathroom, "Hey, hurry up in there, we're gonna be late." To which Jess grunted. Ryan went downstairs to make sure they had his wallet and keys. While grabbing them from the dish on the dining room table, he heard a loud scream and a thud coming from the upstairs shower. Without thinking, Ryan sprung into action. He bolted up the stairs, screaming Jess's name to no response. The shower was off at this point. As Ryan flung open the door, he looked to the right, and he saw Jess laying on the shower floor, unconscious. He ran to her, and as he reached their body, the door slammed behind him. Startled, he quickly turned around. A tall figure with a mask on was behind the door when he entered the room. The mask looked like a deformed face. He recognized the face. It was that of his father. Before he could even react, the figure pounced on Ryan and injected him in the neck with a syringe. Ryan tried to fight off the attack, but very quickly he felt his body numb and his consciousness fade. Ryan woke up in a dark room. Dazed for a few moments, he tried to look around. When he attempted to move, he felt his hands and feet were bound to a chair. In a panic, he remembered what had happened before he woke up. He screamed, "What's going on? Where's Jess?" After a few moments of silence around him, and Ryan frantically trying to get out of his shackles, a light turned on to the left of him, and then front left, then front right, then to his right. Ryan knew where he was. This was the old house of horrors he had gone to as a teenager. It had been shut down for years. To his left was the claustrophobia cave, front left the pits of hell, front right the house of mirrors, and to his right was where he fell in love with Jess in the Hall of the Dead. All those years ago, when Jess had gotten afraid, she had jumped back into Ryan, both of them tumbling. They both laughed. This is where their love blossomed. "What the fuck is going on?" Ryan bellowed out. There was a huge screen in the center of the room that turned on. On it was the very man that was in his bathroom, wearing the mask of his father's distorted face. "Hello, Ryan," a dark voice emitted from the screen. It sounded like a voice changer was in use. "Who are you? Why do you have that mask?" Ryan immediately felt a surge of electricity emanate through his shackles. The voice bellowed out, "Silence! In due time. You lived your life by your rules, and now you will follow mine." Ryan replied, "Who are—" He immediately felt the same surge of electricity course through his body. The man on the screen yelled, "One more time and I leave it running." Stunned and out of breath, Ryan bit his tongue. The man on the screen continued, "This is my realm. Here you will play by my rules." To the far left he saw a screen above the claustrophobia cave. On the screen was Blake. At the top of the screen was what looked like a digital timer, stuck on 15 minutes. The voice continued, "You take from the world around you. Now your world will be taken from you. But I am not without honor. I will give you a chance to overcome your circumstances. You have a button on the ground to press, but be aware that once you press that, the timer starts." Ryan looked closer at Blake on the screen. He was blindfolded. He was near the end of the cave, where he would exit to the main lobby. He was bound and gagged, but Ryan could see him trying to move. The voice continued, "Once that timer starts, Blake's time starts running out. You are to free him before the timer hits 0, or—" Blake feels what it really is to be in a small space. Ryan couldn't help it but scream out, "Why are you doing this?" "In due time," the man replied. "Try and run and Blake's fate will come much sooner. When you're ready, make your move." Ryan was panicking, but remembered what his dad had taught him when he was a child. Take deep breaths and clear your mind. After calming himself a bit, Ryan started remembering being in the cave as a child. It was a dark corridor where the walls went in and out while you walked through it. He had been in there so many times that he could map out his moves before starting. Once he felt he had fully mapped it out, he felt around with his feet until he felt the button. He then proceeded to press it down. Immediately his shackles came off. He looked behind him to the main doors. They were all boarded up. Kids used to break in all the time since the place closed down. So eventually the bank put up metal barriers to keep intruders out. Ryan then heard the timer start on the screen Blake was on. He then heard loud churning of gears. He looked at the screen and saw the walls around Blake were slowly panning into the camera frame. "What the fuck?" Ryan whispered to himself. Now that he was free, he felt something on his neck. There was a collar around it with a red light emanating from it. The voice started up again. "Ah, yes, I forgot to mention. If you don't enter the rooms, you will be blown to bits. Off with your head, as they say." The voice cackled wildly, then through its laughter said, 14 minutes left. I would hurry if I were you." Ryan bolted towards the entrance to the cave. Upon entry, the door slammed behind him, and he could hear what must have been automated locks activate. Ryan, in a state of panic again, calmed himself. He tried to remember the path and put his hand to the right where the walls should be, but it wasn't there. Ryan figured if this man went to the trouble to rig all of this, he probably moved things around. Ryan felt out in front of himself and found a wall. He knew for certain he must go left. That's towards the exit. After a few feet, he felt a sharp pain in his hand. He winced. He could feel blood dripping from his hand. This lunatic must have put traps all through this place, he thought. Ryan was now panicking. He couldn't see, and his only way out of there was to feel around. 10 minutes, an automated voice bellowed out from the timer. Ryan knew that he had no choice but to keep moving. He figured since the left made sense, right would have been the move of a madman. He proceeded to the right and found himself in a narrow passage. He figured his best bet was to venture through and hope for the best. On his way through the tight squeeze, he heard a noise coming through the floor, a mechanical thumping. He attempted to listen to the rhythm and locations of these various thumps. 5 minutes, the timer stated. Ryan knew he needed to hurry, but he also knew being fast could be his death. Ryan did his best to step over the loud thumps. After successfully making it past a few thumps, he felt the walls get tighter. He turned his body sideways and kept trudging through the dark, tight corridor. He suddenly felt an intense pain on his back. The walls around him were sharp, with blades running across it horizontally. He yelled in pain. The timer bellowed out, 1 minute. In a rush, Ryan pushed through the pain, slicing himself up in the process. He could then see light emanating from the exit room. In a hurry, he ran towards the door. Then he felt a pressure on his leg. It had been a tripwire. A knife shot out of the floor and went straight through Ryan's right foot. He screamed in pain, but knowing the consequences of staying, he quickly hobbled to the exit room. As he entered, he heard beeping, and the voice of the man stayed so close. Ryan looked at the floor. Blake was shrieking, however it was muffled by the gag. The walls were pushing on his body now. Ryan could hear his bones cracking, see his skin splitting. He ran over and tried to pry the walls apart, but there was no hope. The walls continued moving, and soon Blake's bellows were replaced with gurgling noises and loud snaps and cracks. Before long, Ryan watched the walls close entirely, blood spurting in every direction. After the walls touched, they quickly retracted. Ryan was in a state of shock. In front of him was a floor covered in every bodily fluid imaginable. He was covered in it as well. The man yelled out in a demonic voice, "Get out here now!" Ryan then heard the walls around him closing and saw the ones Blake was just crushed by closing too. Ryan bolted through the exit, forgetting about his pain momentarily. Upon exiting the cave, he heard the walls slam shut. Ryan's heart was racing. He could barely catch his breath. The main screen turned back on. The man wearing the mask of his distorted father's face was standing there laughing. "You were so close, Ryan. Better luck next time. You sick fuck," Ryan bellowed out. The man on the screen quickly replied, "You hold your tongue. You seem to forget that I have your life in my hands." Speaking of which, the man on the screen looked to his right, Ryan's left. The monitor above the pits of hell lit up. On it was Shay. She was screaming, hanging above a large vat, hands and feet bound. "As you can imagine, that's not a bath," the masked man stated. "That's piranha solution, a mixture of sulfuric acid and hydrogen peroxide. It can eat through anything. Quite a sight to see, really." Ryan started sobbing. Between the gouges on his hand and his back and the throbbing pain in his foot, he was feeling defeated. "Oh, come on now, Ryan. Never took you for such a bitch." 15 minutes goes on the clock. The man with the mask spun around theatrically and pointed to the pits of hell. "You have 5 minutes to enter that room, or..." The masked man held up a remote and stated, "Boom." With that, the TV shut off. Ryan was freaking out, but he knew his best bet was to quickly lick his wounds and proceed. He tore off his shirt, ripping off his sleeve and tying it around his hand. Then he proceeded to take the other sleeve and fasten it tightly around his foot. He then quickly stepped into the pits of hell. Upon entry, it was as he remembered. A cheesy demon sitting at the doorway stated, "Enjoy your stay, it's forever." Ryan felt like laughing, but granted the circumstances, that quickly faded. Red stalagmites hang from the ceiling and the floor looked wet. Ryan started bounding towards the next part of the room. Inside of it was a wheel of torture. "Come on, come on, see the act of the century. Our very own Ryan will be our contestant." Ryan heard the wall in front of him shift. The man with the mask was there. Ryan started charging at the man. The masked man immediately held up a remote and stated, "Remember what is at stake here, buddy. Ryan stopped in his tracks, furious but reserved. "I'll kill you," Ryan stated. "In due time. First go over to that wheel there and close your eyes." Ryan was about to argue, but then he heard the timer state 10 minutes. The masked man continued, "Don't move a muscle or I'll blow you up." Ryan didn't dare move. The masked man proceeded to bind his hands and legs to the wheel, and then he blindfolded Ryan. Ryan could feel the man place a remote in his hand. That remote is to the pitching machine on the other side of the room. You must press it 5 times. However, each time you press it, a knife will be cast in your direction. Remember, you must act fast or lights out. With that, the wheel started to spin. Ryan was disoriented, but he knew that he had no choice but to try and save Shay. If he didn't try, he was dead anyways. He pressed the button. A knife came whizzing through the room. He heard a loud thud next to his head, and with a sigh of relief, he then heard the timer. 5 minutes left. Ryan quickly pressed the button again. This time he was not so lucky. He felt a pain on the side of his abdomen. "Ouch," stated the masked man as he laughed. Ryan pressed the button again. A knife landed right next to his thigh. 2 more to go. Let's give it up for our contestants," said the masked man. Ryan pressed the button one more time. Ryan thought he was in the clear, but the splitting pain seared through his arm. The knife had pierced through his left forearm. Ryan screamed out in pain, almost dropping the remote. He proceeded to press it one last time. This last knife landed on his right hand, cutting his ring finger clear off. In shock, Ryan heard the timer state 1 minute. "Let me out," Ryan managed to whimper. The wheel stopped spinning and the shackles had fallen off. Ryan started falling, but was stopped due to the knife in his forearm. He screamed in pain as the knife continued to cut further up his arm. He quickly took off his blindfold and with his right hand, which luckily enough was only missing a finger, tore the knife out of the wall and fell to the floor. Luckily, the chest wound was only on his side. If the knife was 1 inch over, it would have been inside of him. He looked around to see if the masked man was there, but he must have left during the hysteria. Ryan, on pure adrenaline, ran towards the exit. He saw Shay inches away from the acid. To his right was a glass box, with multiple blades pointing away from the opening. In the center was a switch. Ryan quickly put his left hand into the glass box. He figured that the blood loss from his forearm might dull the pain. The blades were fashioned so that they were all pointing towards the switch. Ryan could push through, getting cut deeper as he went. Without thinking, he started pushing his hand into the blades. He screamed almost as loud as Shay, whose best attempts to raise her feet out of the acid was failing. The acid bubbled and started turning black. Shay's time was fading. Ryan shoved his hand further into the box and hit the switch. By now, most of Shay's lower half was in the solution. She was convulsing at this point. "Let her go, Ryan. You're prolonging her pain," the masked man said as he cackled. Ryan started crying. Seeing Shay like this broke him. He turned the switch back on, and within seconds, Shay was gone. The solution kept bubbling and eventually turned back to more clear color. No sign of Shay was left. Ryan stood there not knowing what to do. Now his mangled hand was past the knives, each knife's tip protruding into his wrist. "You have 1 minute before I come in there and throw you in that acid myself, Ryan," said the masked man. Ryan panicked. He didn't know what to do but pull. He managed to pivot his feet and got ready to pull as hard as he could. He knew if it wasn't hard enough, the combined friction of the many blades would stop him halfway. He yanked on his arm, tearing his hand to shreds. He passed out from the pure agony he was in. Ryan woke up surrounded by mirrors. His right finger had been bandaged, and his left forearm and mangled hand was bandaged as well. He was in the chair again, bound and unable to move. A phone was sitting on the floor in front of him. The screen lit up. On it was the masked man. "We've been through a lot, Ryan, more than you know." Ryan's mind raced. Did this person know him? This is a room of reflection. It's easy to look at other people for your problems, but looking at oneself will always yield fault. Ryan was stunned. His father would always say that. "Who are you?" Ryan lightly stated. "Make it out of here and you'll be one step closer to the answers you seek. This room is for your own self-reflection." The masked man then chuckled to himself. "Where's Jess?" Ryan screamed. "You will be reacquainted with her soon. Just like before, the button is on the floor. Release your shackles and claim your freedom." The phone shut off, and Ryan knew if he didn't move, he was dead. He quickly looked around and noticed that this wasn't the room he remembered. The mirrors were everywhere and seemed endless. Ryan hit the button and stood up quickly after the shackles had released. Ryan started feeling around the walls to try and find the way out. As he did, the first mirror he touched shattered immediately, raining glass all over him. Behind it was a dark wall. The masked man's voice bellowed out from the lobby. "You think I would let you get away with that? Touch the walls and they will shatter. Shatter 5 walls and boom." Ryan was freaking out, but he knew he had to use this to his advantage. Breaking mirrors could help him find the way out. They would create gaps in the image. He quickly turned around and found the path to the next section of the hall. Ryan entered the room and then proceeded to run straight into a mirror. Glass fell down as Ryan covered his head. 2 down, he heard the voice state. Not soon after, the timer stated 10 minutes left. Ryan proceeded to try and gauge the next segment and took a few pieces of glass off the floor. He slit his arm and drew blood to cover the shards. He used them as breadcrumbs to let himself know where he came from. He continued forwards, finding the next segment of the hall. 5 minutes, the timer stated. Ryan frantically ran forwards and broke another mirror. That's 3, the voice stated. Ryan quickly got on his feet and continued. He could see the exit, but needed to find the right opening. While turning around, Ryan brushed up against another panel. It too shattered. Oh no, that's 4. Watch out. Last chance. Ryan had a total of 6 mirrors around him. 2 were broken and 1 had a bloody shard near it. His chances were 33%. 1 was the exit and 2 were false. 1 minute, the timer stated. Ryan was freaking out, but he knew he had to choose quick. He lunged towards the middle path and burst through the exit doors to the lobby. To the left was the last room, the Hall of the Dead, and he knew Jess must have been in there. The screen kicked on, but what he saw was unthinkable. Jess was pinned to the wall. A massive saw was protruding through the wall next to her. But on the other side of the room there was another person. Against the wall was his mother, in an identical trap to the one Jess was in. "Why are you doing this?" Ryan screamed. Now, said the masked man. "We know how this works. 15 minutes on the board. I'll give you 5 minutes to enter, Ryan. We can't hold up the line." Ryan tried to make sense of this. How was he to save them both? Why was his mother here? Why were any of them here? Ryan knew that this questioning would get him nowhere, and he knew he had to hurry. He pushed past the doors into the Hall of the Dead, hearing them lock behind him. Upon entry, he saw that most things were as they were. However, where all of the animatronics and employees used to be was now covered in entrails and blood. Ryan held back his vomit and proceeded forwards. Getting to the second segment of the halls, he saw the section where the chainsaw-wielding man used to stand. That scared him and Jess all those years ago. Ryan whispered, "This is where..." He was cut off by the masked man. "You and her fell in love. It's funny how this is where it ends too." Ryan screamed, "I'll end you." "Calm down now, slugger." Ryan's father would always call him that. How did this guy know so much about his life? Why did he target him so intensely? Ryan then heard a trap door open from the ceiling where the chainsaw-wielding man used to stand. Out fell a decrepit corpse. The body was decayed. All of its fingers were missing and the face looked the most decayed. Nothing but bone was showing. Ryan almost threw up from the stench. 10 minutes, the timer stated. Ryan knew he needed to hurry. He was expecting some traps, but it seemed not much had been done to this place. Almost at the final room, he looked down and he saw Shay and Blake's wedding rings covered in what he now assumed was Blake's guts. He picked them up and carried on. The final segment of the Hall of the Dead was a white-tiled room. It used to be a fake surgical room where zombies would break out of their bindings and attack the doctors who were experimenting on them, and then they would all chase you out of the hall. But the room was bare. That is, except for Jess and his mother. 5 minutes left, the timer stated. Ryan saw they were both gagged and quickly ran over and took the tape off of their mouths, starting with his mother. She started crying, questioning what was going on. He then ran over to Jess and did the same. She was equally as incoherent and frantic. The voice bellowed out with the same demonic tone, much louder than before. "Silence!" The room came to a hush, minus the 2 massive saws protruding from the walls. In life, Ryan, you have taken from others, and this room is no different. In front of your mother and your lover are levers. They will manually move the saw across the wall. Once the saw reaches its final destination, the other will be freed. Ryan noticed that each track went from one side to the other of his mother and Jess, through their midsection. "You'll never make me do it," Ryan yelled. "You tend to forget this is my show," the man stated. "If you don't decide quickly, not only will they both die, so will you." Jess started hyperventilating and crying frantically. Ryan's mother, however, was calm, looking at Ryan. "Son, you have a long life ahead of you, and so does she. Make babies, live a full life, and know I'll always love you," she said. Ryan started screaming while crying. "No, I can't." The timer outside stated, 1 minute left. Ryan's mom said, "Since your father's disappearance, I have only survived by seeing you become a great man. You inspire me, son. Now go before it's too late." "Time's almost up, Ryan," the voice stated. Both saws started moving towards Ryan's mother and Jess. Ryan quickly ran over to his mother. He gave her a hug and kissed her on the forehead, and then grabbed a hold of the lever just in front of her. His mother seemed sad, but glad that she could see her son one last time. Ryan said, "Look at me, Mom, just look at me." And then he proceeded to push the lever away from the saw and towards his mother. The saw quickly started cutting through her. She yelled as Ryan watched the life drain from her eyes. Jess was screaming. Her saw was getting very close to her abdomen. Ryan pushed harder, blood spewing onto him, his eyes now closed. He kept pushing hard on the lever to end his mother's suffering. He heard the snap of her spinal cord and the lever grew lighter as he passed through her. Jess let out a blood-curdling scream as the saw started piercing her abdomen. Ryan had just finished sawing through his mother as Jess's saw stopped just in time. "Bravo, Ryan," the voice stated. But this time it sounded as if he was in the room with Ryan. He was behind him. He turned around to see the masked man standing at the exit. The lights then flickered off. Ryan bolted towards the masked man, but he felt a needle protrude into his neck from the explosive collar he was wearing. He passed out inches from the masked man. Ryan woke up in the back room of the House of Horrors, bound to a chair once again, but these bindings were leather and built into the chair, unlike his previous metal shackles. In front of him, Jess was bound and gagged. She was unconscious. Ryan yelled, "I played your games. It's over. Let us go." A familiar voice came from behind him. "Hey there. The games have just begun." Ryan's eyes widened. It was his brother, Josh. "What the hell are you doing?" Ryan screamed. Josh yelled, "Shut your mouth. If you know what's good for you. You stole her from me, Ryan. Why would you steal my girlfriend? That night I was ahead of you guys. You both were children, scared about nothing." Ryan replied, "You're a psychopath. We always knew it. Our cat's always going missing, your numbness." She didn't even like. Ryan was cut short as Josh ran over to Jess and shoved a knife into her thigh. She quickly woke up and screamed, however muffled it was. "Stop!" Ryan yelled. Josh replied, "I thought you knew by now to listen and obey." Josh proceeded to grab a pair of metal shears and snip off Jess's right finger where Ryan's wedding ring sat. Jess moaned but tried to stop herself as she knew it could make things so much worse. Her eyes were wide, staring straight into Ryan's. Ryan had tears rolling down his face and anger building inside of him. To this point, adrenaline had him going, but he could feel his left arm numb from all the damage, and his whole body was aching from all that he endured. "You stole her from me, and Dad protected you." He said, "It's easy to look at other people for your problems, but looking at oneself will always yield fault. And you're the fault, Ryan. That's why I took Dad's fingers and his face." Josh slid the mask he had been wearing to Ryan's feet. It was his father's face, just years old and poorly preserved. Ryan was furious, but knew saying anything would get Jess killed. He looked at Josh with the dirtiest look anyone could ever give. "I thought Dad would be enough, but I had a pain inside of me, Ryan. One that years of holding back just grew." Josh then stabbed another knife into Jess's other thigh. "Kill me, please let her go," Ryan said lightly, hoping this would stop Josh's madness. "Oh brother, you will get your turn. I have been planning this day since we were young. Our first time coming here, I realized that people can appreciate my darkness. People can appreciate pain and suffering. And now I want you to understand my pain." Josh took both knives out of Jess's legs. Blood spurted from the wounds. Jess was close to passing out from the pain and blood loss as Josh violently stabbed Jess in the lower abdomen. Jess's eyes widened once again, but this time all she could do was stare at Ryan in confusion. Ryan screamed, his loss of everything, his father, his mother, the love of his life, and his unborn child. He let out a howl that could only be explained as inhuman. Josh then proceeded to grab the knife in Jess's gut with two hands and raise it up through her abdomen to the top of her torso. Jess's eyes stared at Ryan as her life force faded. Ryan whimpered, "Just end this already, Josh." "On my terms, brother," Josh replied. He then proceeded to wheel over a table full of what could only be explained as torture devices. Just then, they could hear the backstage entrance swing open. It was the police. Someone had tipped them off about a man carrying vast amount of equipment into the building, as well as hearing a lot of noises coming from the building. Ryan screamed, "In here!" The police started charging towards the backstage room. Josh stated, "You won't get off that easy," as the police started pounding on the door, which had no lock, but Josh had barricaded it with various heavy objects from the room. Every time they bashed, the door opened inch by inch. Josh pulled out a gun and pointed it at Ryan. "Goodbye, brother," he stated. He then proceeded to shoot 2 bullets into Ryan's chest, puncturing his lung and another hitting his mid-chest. Ryan immediately felt searing pain and started choking on his own blood. Josh then proceeded to put the gun under his own chin. "See you in hell, Ryan," he stated as he blew his brains out. Ryan was growing weak and eventually passed out. Weeks later, Ryan woke from a medically induced coma. Nobody was there to see him. Nobody was left. He was alone. He looked to his left and saw a stump where his forearm used to be. A nurse called his lawyer as soon as they realized he was awake. When the lawyer arrived, he explained that Ryan's estate was protected for him. He had inherited his childhood home and his home that he and Jess had. He also had inherited the House of Horrors. His brother had bought it months prior to the incident. Ryan, unable to talk due to months of stasis, shed a tear, remembering all that had happened. Within a few weeks, Ryan was cleared medically and mentally and was released. After his departure, he sold his home and his family's home. Too many memories surrounded those homes and he couldn't take it. After both were sold, he took a cab from his hotel room to the House of Horrors. He entered the back door to see most of what had happened was wiped from that place. All that was left were bloodstains. Ryan started sobbing and walked into the main corridor. He curled up into a ball, crying himself to sleep. Teddy woke up strapped to a chair in a dark room. A screen flashed before his eyes. Standing there was a man wearing a mask with a distorted face on it. "Hello," a robotic voice emitted from the masked man. "You killed your deceased brother's son, Teddy, so you could keep your family's inheritance." Teddy bellowed out, "What are you talking about?" The masked man then proceeded to electrocute Teddy. "Silence. This is my realm. Here you will play by my rules." Teddy quickly shut his mouth and looked at the screen. Teddy noticed the man was tall in stature and was missing his left arm. The man continued, "You take from the world around you, and now it will take from you." A screen then flashed on to Teddy's left. On it was his daughter, surrounded by barbed wire, unable to move and screaming in pain. "335 Applewood Street. The house has been the talk of the town since the early 50s. It is said that the father went crazy and killed his family, to then have committed suicide by hanging. Some say the rope still swings in the basement at night. It has been many years since then. The town was remote and small. Not too many visitors came by. No local would buy the property, and most outsiders were warded off from moving to the town due to its remote location. Tyrese was a young, fit man. He worked construction, and at that, he worked hard for his money. Next to him, a realtor from out of town, fancy clothes and a clipboard in her hand. They both would stare at the house in front of them. It was well built, as many were back then. Massive peaks on the roof, old shutters still intact. It was truly a beautiful but eerie-looking house. The realtor stated to Tyrese, "Shall we?" The two proceeded to walk into the house. Meanwhile, the realtor explained how she by law had to tell him about the murder-suicide that occurred in the house. Tyrese cut her off, saying, "I already know. The townspeople keep telling me to stay away. I have been staying at the motel at the other side of town. I don't believe in ghost stories, ma'am, so no need to divulge further." At that, she nodded her head and smirked. She thought to herself, "Finally, someone is going to get this listing off my hands." The house's price was set at a steal, and Tyrese, wanting to own his own home and stop being in the rat race of the city, was excited to purchase it. Tyrese proceeded to sign the proper paperwork and get his new life started, away from the crazy existence he was living back in the city. He found he loved the region and had already found a new job for the only handyman service in town. He would stay at the nearby hotel, working on his house during the day in his spare time, getting the electrical fixed and trying to get the house in order. The beds of the previous family still sat in their respective rooms, old and tattered. Walking into the house, you would enter the living room. To the right was the dining room and kitchen. There was a door in the kitchen that led to the basement. If you were to continue from the front door straight through the living room, you were met with a hallway. To the left, the bathroom. In front of you, what seemed like the master bedroom. And to the right was a set of stairs. Up the stairs, you would find 2 bedrooms of equal size. The house has been sealed for many years, and surprisingly wasn't vandalized. Most of the house lay bare with cobwebs covering it. After a few days, Tyrese was trying to get the water working. He decided he was going to stay as late as he had to in order to fix the pipes leading up to the main valve, in order to start staying there at night and get the job done quicker without paying for the hotel every day. Paying this small, well-built old town was not what it used to be back in the city. Tyrese had tried all night to trace the main line down to the front yard and get his water finally turned on. In the city, he was used to the main line being in the basement, everything going outside of his house being the city's problem. But in this old town, it was constructed with the main lines by the curb, then running under the front lawn to the basements of the houses. After hours and hours of digging, he finally grew extremely tired and had pushed himself too far. At this, he decided to get into his truck and go back to the hotel room. He was defeated. However, when he tried to start up the old bucket of bones, it wouldn't turn over. Tyrese worked hard to get where he was, but he had to cut many corners along the way to get there. He tried to call the only tow service for miles, but it seemed like every business in the region was shut down for the night. He decided he might as well go back inside and take a rest on the bed in the basement. This one was at least wrapped in plastic and mostly intact. Tyrese grabbed his supplies, 2 bottles of water, and his leftovers from his dinner that day. He proceeded down the stairs to the dark and gloomy basement. Completely exhausted, all he could think of is falling asleep. He crashed on the bed, looking past its stench. He proceeded to fall asleep very quickly. Tyrese would enter a dream state. A nightmare would be a better name for this encounter. He was looking down as if watching a narration of what was happening. He saw a little girl hiding behind the boiler in the basement. She was a very pretty young child, but she was very dirty and just seemed horrified. Tyrese, in his dream state, felt connected to the girl, as if he was one with her, tethered. He felt as if this was all happening to him. One thing that was quite eerie was the cobwebs were gone, and the smell as well. The basement had been filled with boxes, tools, and other oddities that you would normally see in a basement. The door to the basement slammed open, in pouring a very bitter-looking man, his skin leathery and worn. He looked as if he hadn't eaten in days, wearing tattered overalls and a stained white shirt. He had a very angry but also defeated look in his face. He charged down the stairs. "Lily, where are you? You know you're not allowed out." The girl peered from the boiler scared, but even more scared of what was to come if she didn't obey. Tyrese could feel all the emotions of this child as she was noticed by the man. "Come here, you little brat." He grabbed her by the hair and proceeded up the stairs. Lily screamed, "Dad, stop!" To which the man replied, "Don't call me that." He tore through the kitchen, through the living room, to the hallway. The house was in disarray, now filled with tons of old newspapers, refuse, and under all that the normal amenities you would find in a home. He then continued to march up the staircase to the second floor. On the ceiling upstairs was a hatch, with a painter's ladder sitting underneath it. Tyrese was confused because he remembers the house with only 2 rooms up there and a plastered ceiling. The entrance to the hatch was set in between both bedrooms, so if you were looking down from the hatch, you could see into either bedroom. In one bedroom, a boy named Alex, and the other, a girl named Paisley. The father yelled at Lily, "Go to your room!" Crying and scared, the girl disappeared into the hatch. At this, the father ripped the ladder away and said, "Stay there!" Tyrese loved the house, in part due to its vaulted ceilings. It's what, from a construction standpoint, brought the sight of this house to his attention. At this, Tyrese jolted awake. He was in a state of pure adrenaline. He calmed himself down. Being a doubter of all things supernatural, he quickly brought himself to his senses and assumed that it was just a nightmare. It was morning now, and he called his tow truck and had the car towed. He decided he needed to walk into town to go pick up his truck, which was hopefully finished, and get more supplies. Leaving the supplies he had there for when he came back, now 1 bottle of water and an apple that he still had in his lunch bag. He then proceeded to walk to town. On his way to the hotel, he saw the town library and immediately felt the girl's feelings from his dream again. Not able to shake the tether that they had in that dream, he decided it wouldn't hurt doing some research into the house. Everyone in town had said how 2 children and their mother was murdered by the father, but no one explained the third girl. He came across old clippings of the tragedy, only speaking of the 4 of them dying in that house. No little girl, but not Lily. So Tyrese proceeded to search further. He then found an article about a woman in the town having triplets, one of which was very sick, but the woman's name was redacted from the article. Tyrese couldn't help but to have an eerie feeling. He proceeded to pick up his old truck from the mechanic. It was a simple fix and cheap, so Tyrese decided he might as well grab some supplies and keep working on the water main that day. He acquired the rest of his belongings from the hotel and checked out. He was pretty sure he could get the water working that night. He got back to his new home and got right back to work. He, however, brought with him his cot that he had taken with him from the hotel. It was his plan to move into the house as soon as possible anyways, so he figured he would stay in the house that night. He chuckled when he was too scared to sleep in the basement, so he set up his cot in the master bedroom on the main floor, since that was to be his room anyways. He was almost finished with the main water line, but from his long trek and then hard labor, he decided he would finish installing the new piping in the morning. He quickly finished off his water bottle and ate his apple and got to sleeping in the master bedroom. There he woke, in another dream state. He was peering through a crack in the door, well, the little girl was, into the master bedroom. The father was screaming at the mother. "That child took everything from us. After she was born, she just kept leeching from our savings. Her treatments weren't worth this. After all I've done now, I am to die? What will come of all of you? This tumor will be the end of us all." The mother lay there, a shell of a woman. She looked to be in her early 40s, but her hair was tattered, thin and gray. She just sat in the rocking chair lifeless, barely moving and expressionless. She wore a tattered sundress stained like the husband's clothes. The father continued yelling when Lily accidentally pushed on the door, the hinges screeching by the minuscule movement. The father quickly turned around and saw her. "What did I tell you?" He swung the door open and chased her up the stairs, the ladder still shaking as he reached the top step. But this time he didn't take the ladder away. Instead, he called for the other 2 children to go up as well. He then followed them up the crawl space. The room was mainly empty, except for a handmade bed with straps on it. The walls were made of brick. He had forced Lily into the straps with the other 2 kids watching. You would think these kids would be horrified at the sight, but they were both smirking, almost excited and unable to wait. Lily then flashed memories into Tyrese's tethered mind. It was of her as a 3-year-old in that same room. She was being beaten by her father. He would yell and explain how it was all her fault, that they were poor, explain to the other kids that she deserved this. This would explain why the two deranged children looked up at the situation as if it was a treat. Tyrese could feel her fear. The father then proceeded to have each child hit her in the stomach repeatedly. Tyrese and/or Lily screaming in pain. At this, he woke again. Tyrese was so scared, but after running out of the master bedroom, he felt his doubting of the supernatural fading. He decided to finish the work on the waterline, absolutely terrified of the house at this point. His curiosity and feeling the tether still active getting the best of him. He decided he would stay. He felt it was his duty to stay for Lily. Later that night, he walked down into the basement, and under the steps he saw it. The exact same ladder, folded up right underneath the steps. Now he was sure there was a room in the attic. He brought the old ladder upstairs, right in between the two bedrooms, and started breaking the ceiling with his hammer, only to reveal a square, thick piece of steel bolted over what must have been the hatch. He quickly and desperately tore it off with all his strength, and with great help from his trusty hammer. He then dropped the hammer to the floor in awe of what he was seeing. It was the room, the same exact brickwork, inside, sealing any light or possible exit. The bed in the middle of the room. In the corner he saw what used to be a young girl's body, mummified and curled up into a ball. His heart dropped. Lily. He then thought about when he slept in the basement, he saw what happened there, and when he slept in the master bedroom, what transpired in there. So for Lily's sake, he decided to sleep in the attic tonight. He thought he was crazy. He should be reporting this, not sleeping in a room with a corpse. But he felt her story needed to be told. He threw a blanket over Lily. He felt the need to do this for her. He fell asleep eventually, and once again, it was as if he was in Lily's body. This time she was in her room, in the attic, peering out of the hatch. He could feel her memories slipping deeper into his dreams. She was looking into her sister's room. She, just like the rest of the family, living in filth. She was beheading dolls. Another memory flashed into his mind of her telling a young boy, most likely a neighborhood friend since Lily didn't know him, jumping from the top of the stairs to the bottom, hurting himself. She had talked him into showing her how brave he really was. This was then preceded with memories of Lily looking into her brother's room. He was terrorizing the house cat, Lily cringing inside with every yelp the cat put out. He looked up at her and smirked, an evil smirk. He threw the pocket knife he was holding up towards her hatch and yelled, "I'll get you someday, you brat." Lily now sat in her room crying. After this, Tyrese was in his own body, but still in the dream state. He walked over to the crying Lily. "What happened? I need to know." She pointed behind him, and as he turned around, he was back in the tether. Lily was hanging down from the hatch, getting her feet as close to the floor as she could before dropping out, as she has done many times before. Sneaking through the house, she saw no one, but didn't hear anyone leave. In her time being in the room, she could identify who was where and where they had went, just based on the different sounds of the doors creaking and the footsteps of her family. But she had heard them pile into the basement. She was walking down the steps and looked to her right. Her mother was in her room in a rocking chair, door wide open. Her throat was slit. She was horrified, but proceeded into the kitchen to look down the stairs into the basement. Her head was barely sticking into the doorframe. Her father was down there yelling at the two kids. "Come back! This is how we can be with your mother! She told me what to do. She's in my head. She's here." He was clearly losing it due to the tumor. "I see you, Alex." The father had grabbed the boy, only to be stuck with his pocket knife right in the arm. The father looked as if nothing happened, as if there was no pain to the injury. He quickly grabbed the boy and threw him to the ground. Removing the knife from his arm, he raised it up and plunged it into Alex's gut. "This won't hurt, son. Don't worry, we'll be together soon. It will all be different." Paisley, hiding under the stairs, tried to make a run for it, but he heard her. He grabbed her and said, "There's nothing to fear, my dear." He proceeded to carry her over to her brother. He stuck his hands inside his open chest cavity and started covering himself in the blood. He then forced Lily's sister, Paisley, to partake in the ritual. She was scared, but she was also warped enough from the lack of outside influence. She followed her father's actions without much fight. The father then proceeded to stick Paisley with the knife while she was distracted staring at her brother's lifeless body. The father then continued with his ritual on Paisley. At this, Lily gasped. He turned around and saw her. There was a noose hanging from the rafters in the center of the room. He rushed past the noose and caught Lily running towards the front door. Lily screamed now, held under her father's arm covered in her siblings' blood. "I told you to stay there. Now I'll make sure you stay there forever." Lily screamed, "Please don't kill me." The father replied, "I don't want you with us. I would never perform the ritual on the likes of you." He grabbed a ladder from under his bed, put Lily in her room, and proceeded to bolt a thick piece of sheet metal onto her hatch.
He then grabbed the ladder and brought it downstairs, placing it under the staircase. Lily could hear every heavily crazed step till he hit the basement. She then heard a loud thump. This must have been his hanging. She heard a few minutes of creaking and then silence. Eternal silence. Tyrese woke up screaming. He knew it must be real, that poor Lily had endured a horrible life with a tragic ending. Trying to leave and phone the authorities, he made his way towards the hatch, but the steel plate was back. He then remembered he left his hammer at the bottom of the ladder. How? He screamed. How is this possible? He would bang on the steel plate for hours, with no luck, hands bloody. Then he thought maybe he could take the brick wall out. It must be brittle and old at this point. He broke a piece of wood off of the bed and started chipping away at the mortar in between the bricks. It was dark, so this was no easy task. After his hands were bloodied, he had removed a few bricks. He would find that there was a thick layer of mortar with rebar behind the bricks. From his construction experience, he figured there was even another layer of brick beyond that. It was impossible for him to break through this in one day, and he grew extremely exhausted after having been in a panic trying to escape the small cell for hours. On top of that, he hadn't eaten or drank anything since yesterday. At that, he was horrified of what was next to come. He tried to stay awake as long as possible, but eventually, without warning, he nodded off. When he woke, he was still upstairs, but this time Lily was still a corpse in the corner. He had a sigh of relief that he hadn't had to endure another nightmare. He heard the steel latch being taken off, and he was excited for his freedom. He assumed all the noise he made maybe alerted neighbors to something being wrong. Once the hatch was off, he lay there looking at the light that entered the room. But what he saw horrified him. The father. He was peeking his head into the room, staring right at Tyrese. He proceeded to crawl into the attic. Tyrese looked around for a brick from the wall that he had destroyed to defend himself, but it seemed as if he had never touched the wall, and it was still fully intact. He looked at the bed with restraints next to him, but it no longer looked like it was rotting anymore, but fresh wood once again. At this, the father continued towards him and grabbed him by the throat. Suddenly, Paisley and Alex came through the hatch as well, stomachs split wide open, both with crazed looks and massive grins on their face. As if they weren't human, they quickly, with immense speed, ran up to Tyrese and grabbed both of his arms, pinning him in place. Tyrese looked up at the father to see a massive red and purple line across his throat. He was horrified. He tried screaming, but he was quickly met with the father's other hand over his mouth. After this, it was as if the father had taken his voice. The family quickly strapped Tyrese into bed. Tyrese trying to scream, but he was only met with breathlessness. He looked into the corner of the room, and the mother was just standing there, throat slit, looking down at Tyrese, almost looking sad, as if she never wanted any of this. The father proceeded to plunge a knife into Tyrese's stomach. Held back by his restraints, he was unable to move and incapable of screaming. All you could see is the pain in his face, and his eyes widen as he attempted to let out any kinds of sounds. The three proceeded to tear his insides out and drench themselves in his blood. Tyrese would never wake again. Months later, the very same realtor was standing outside waiting for her new clients. A young couple had been viewing the house and was equally unwilling to accept the supernatural, just as Tyrese was. The realtor would explain the horrors of the house, and that the most recent owner fixed the water supply only to skip town and stop paying his mortgage, which was odd considering he paid half of the house's value up front. The couple decided they wouldn't back down due to some ghost stories and purchased the home. They quickly moved all of their belongings into the basement so they could fix up the house and slowly put their belongings in upstairs over time. The very same night that they moved everything into the basement, they were exhausted and decided they couldn't move another muscle. Since they already had a mattress set up in the basement, they decided they would bring it upstairs in the morning and laid down to rest for the night, both falling asleep relatively fast, and quickly both dreaming. They both dreamt they were in the basement, but their stuff wasn't there. Instead, it was a bunch of boxes, tools, and belongings they didn't recognize. That's when they saw a little girl come from behind the boiler, looking scared. After they saw a large man step from behind her, his stomach was wide open, near gutless. He proceeded to put his hand on Lily's shoulder to comfort her. He looked at them with fear, however, so they weren't necessarily scared of him, just the sight of him. He pointed to the staircase with one hand, and with the other put a finger over his mouth. As the couple turned around, the basement door flung open. The Trenton Psychiatric Hospital stood tall and decayed. Previously named the New Jersey Lunatic Asylum, it had been shut down and reopened over the years under different names. It opened in 1848. It was a place to amass the mentally unfit. The hospital still remains today, utilizing a small amount of the property to house about 400 beds worth of patients. A large portion of the facility, however, is decaying and abandoned. In their appropriate beds were Joey and Jordan, in another sect of the renovated building, Martha and Olive. Joey suffered from depression. Not your run-of-the-mill depression, however. He had suicidal tendencies and would often have a dark and gloomy demeanor. This, however, did not stop him from drawing to cope with his illness. He would create the most amazing black and white pictures, generally centered around the horror genre. Jordan was a high-grade schizophrenic. He had a lot of fight in him, however. He was mildly aware of what was certainly real. He often heard voices and saw shadowy figures stalking him. Martha had extreme anxiety. She was scared of just about everything, and felt the world was out to get her. She would commonly have panic attacks. Through her long-term treatment, however, she had learned to try and push through all of it. She would close her eyes, breathe methodically, and count to 10, then proceed to force herself to trudge through whatever the task at hand was. Olive had PTSD. She rarely talked about what happened to her. The therapist knew she was horribly abused as a child, and she quite often could not trust people and would stay away from men. This, however, didn't stop her from fostering an amazing friendship with Martha. The four had decided to sneak out and explore the abandoned parts of the facility that were closed off to the public. Jordan was excited to sneak out. He was more adventurous than the rest of the bunch. Joey was excited as well. It's not often that he would feel excitement, but he knew he would find some truly ominous things to draw on his trip through the abandoned buildings. Olive was terrified, so was Martha, but they put up a front in order to try and impress each other with their bravery. That night, they all set out to escape by asking to go to the bathroom. They had all shown great promise, having been at the hospital for years at this point, and they were on an honor system. No residents had to follow them around. Especially Jordan, because when they used to, he would mistake them for his shadow figures and would start running away in fear. Joey and Jordan looking at the clock inside of their bathroom, Martha and Olive doing the same. At the strike of midnight, mind you, this was the time the least staff was around, increasing their odds of getting away with their little escape. They all jumped out the bathroom windows to proceed running into the abandoned building's entrance, which had been forced open by many urban explorers of the past. Joey, being an artist, had quite the fascination with the asylum, and trying to scare the bunch, he stated, "In 1907, Dr. Henry Cotton was introduced to the hospital. He believed he could cure patients from removal of their various organs. He treated syphilis by removing teeth, believing that the bacteria would not be able to grow. He believed mental illness was actually disease, and proceeded to remove testicles, ovaries, gallbladders, stomachs, and colons in order to cure the patient's afflictions. Many of his patients had perished. Dr. Cotton would die in 1933, however, his horrible treatments would remain common practice till the 1960s. At this, Jordan was intrigued, however, this also had sparked Martha's anxiety. Martha spoke up, stating, "I think we should head back. This isn't safe." Jordan spoke up, "You're not scared, are you?" Olive gave Jordan a dirty look and started consoling Martha. At that, Jordan thought he saw a shadowy figure appear at the nearby staircase. Over the years, he had been told to confront his delusions. Out of complete mania, he bolted towards the stairs and disappeared up them. Joey started after him, yelling, "Hey, stop, wait up!" Then he looked back at the two girls and said, "What are you waiting for?" The two girls looked at each other, shrugged their shoulders, and followed the group. When Joey and the two girls reached the top of the steps, it was eerily quiet. They called out for Jordan, but heard no response. Scared to all hell, Joey would pull out his camera, not only to take pictures and videos for inspiration, but to use the flash as a guide for their adventure into this dark hallway. They came upon a room, and there was Jordan, standing in the corner, talking to what seemed like nobody. Martha and Olive were standing outside the room. Joey walked up and said, "Hey buddy, are you alright?" Putting his hand on Jordan's shoulder. Jordan quickly turned around. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. Jordan explained, "He was right here. I chased him into this room. He looked like a nurse." The group scanned the room, but to no surprise, there was nobody there. They told Jordan he was probably seeing things, and Jordan took their word for it. He knew sometimes his view of reality was warped. The group proceeded down the hall and searched the various rooms. There was rows of beds and sun, and other baths, chairs, and amenities you would assume to be in such a place. They came upon a door that was heavy and immovable. Jordan saw another figure dart across the corridor from which they came, but this time Olive saw it as well. She was not one to speak much due to her past traumas, but she sure spoke up now. The man was wearing scrubs, but they couldn't make out much else. To that, they all had been quite frightened. Martha was shaking in horror. Joey had been able to catch him on video. He rolled back the footage, and although the video of the man was blurry, he scrolled through the tracks slowly to find the entity had peered over at them. His eyes were dull, as if he was blind in both eyes. They couldn't make out much else due to the sheer distance. The group was horrified and started running in the opposite direction. They then ran up a flight of stairs, planning on running back in the direction they had came from to the large main stairwell they initially had come in on. They could tell that it was an emergency fire staircase spanning every floor of the building. The floor was caving in certain spots on this level and was not stable. That group in their fear just bound down the decrepit hallway. Eventually they had ducked into a room to seek cover for a moment and catch their breath. They all were absolutely exhausted. It wasn't often that they were up so late. Jordan peered out of the window. The floor gave way beneath him, and he had fallen through down to the room beneath. It was filled with jars of liquid and medical instruments. He screamed and was absolutely terrified. Martha was shaking uncontrollably, counting to 10 over and over again. Olive and Joey trying to console her, but with little success. Jordan yelled from the room, "I can't move. I think I broke my leg." The three knew what they had to do, but they hated the idea of it. They proceeded to backtrack down the flight of stairs, listening for Jordan. All they could hear is his immensely growing screams. It was coming from the sealed door. Joey yelled to him, "We'll get help, just calm down." They proceeded to walk towards the emergency fire staircase, sadly in the same direction they had saw that white-eyed man. They were planning on traveling down the many flights of stairs to go outside and get help, but since the majority of the corridors were very similar, they had gotten lost along the way. The three walked into a room to see if maybe there was a window they could peer out of. The room seemed like some sort of lounging room. Outside they could see the entrance that they had come in from. They planned a route to the front door the best they could from inside that room. They would seek further into the room to see if they could find some weapons to self-defend if that man were to find them. Joey found a loose piece of wood. When they searched further into the room, they were hit with a horrible stench. Joey peered around the corner, deep into a room connected to the one they were in. Inside there was multiple people, bloodied skin as if it was falling off. They were just standing there facing the corner. They turned around and looked at Joey with their eyes. They were white and lifeless. The group of deranged, half-dead looking people started chasing them out of the room. They bolted in the direction they knew would bring them to the exit. But when they reached the emergency stairwell, there was more of these zombie-like creatures. They diverted back down the hallway. They now were familiar with the corridor that they were in. It was nearing the sealed door poor Jordan was behind. But now his screams sounded muffled. Joey and Martha were nearing the door when they looked back. Olivia was behind them trying to catch up when a group of these deranged people broke through the door in front of her. The group of decaying humans stood between her and the two others. She screamed. There was nowhere to go. Two male zombie-like people were trying to grab her arms. Her PTSD had kicked in. She thrashed and screamed, "No, not again, never again." This was quickly followed by her turning around and leaping out of the window, falling down many stories. Joey and Martha heard her plummet to the ground, her intense scream fading and then inevitably stopping with a crashing sound. She had landed on a metal awning below. Joey and Martha were horrified, but the creatures were now facing towards them and walking in their direction. They looked in the opposite direction and there was more of these deformed people coming towards them from that way as well. They looked back at Jordan's door to see it was cracked open. Knowing that it was firmly sealed shut before, they figured their best hope for surviving was to seal themselves in there with Jordan. They quickly poured into the room, slamming the door behind them. One of these creatures had stuck their decrepit hand into the door, but when they slammed it shut, the hand broke off with ease, filled with pus and falling apart. They turned around after latching the door to see Jordan. He was strapped to a chair in the center of the room. The two were confused. How could this be? They took a few steps closer to see a large portion of his skin was missing. Jordan was trying to speak, but his teeth were all gone, and he was bleeding from just about everywhere. Next to him was a surgical table and jars, but these didn't seem like they had old organs in them. They seemed fresh. The two stifled their screams. Martha fell to the ground and just started crying, counting to 10 over and over again. Joey had a very sad look in his eyes. He knew Jason's death was imminent. He decided to comfort the poor soul as Martha lost it behind him. He put his hand on Jordan's back. He knew Jordan's death was imminent. He decided to comfort the poor soul as Martha lost it behind him. He put his hand on Jordan's back, which was one of the last places he still had skin. He told him, "I am so sorry, buddy. Relax. Just let go." Jordan looked at him with the one eye that was still in his head and spurted out blood. He eerily whispered, "Run." That's all he could make out before looking towards another steel door in the room. The sounds on the outside of the room had stopped. Joey tried to calm Marcia and then told her what Jordan had said, and they both just looked at each other, horrified. Seeing what happened to Jordan, they figured a plummet to the ground was better than that, and they just had to get out of there. Joey opened the massive metal door to see a completely empty hallway. They both knew, peering outside the door, that the staircase to their left would lead them to a lower level at least. Then they could jump out a window to safety if need be. Joey looked at Jordan one last time. He had died at this point, head cocked downwards. The two rushed out of the room, their game plan set on how to get out of there. They rushed to the staircase and were stunned. These creatures lined the stairs, up and down, just like the emergency staircase. Then from their left they heard a door creak open, the deformed humans pouring out of the room. They started running back towards the room Jordan had met his fate in, hoping to find another stairwell in that direction. but the zombie-like creatures now were bounding back down the hall towards them from that direction as well. Martha dropped to the ground. She was so terrified and panicking, she couldn't even function. Joey started to run. He knew there was nowhere to go, but he figured maybe he could break through the crowd that was coming towards him. He rushed into one of the creatures, their body falling apart on impact. He proceeded to smash through many of these zombie-like people with the piece of wood he found earlier, trying to get past them, but there was too many. The creatures surrounded him at this point, and they proceeded to stockpile on top of him. Joey fell to the ground, hitting his head hard, and passed out. When he came to, he was bound to a chair in the previously sealed-off room. He looked around. Jordan was no longer there. A pile of blood lay at Joey's feet. He looked to his left. There, the door that Jordan had told him to run from. To his right was Martha, or what was left of her. Also strapped to a chair, she lay limp, lifeless. The door to his left flung open. In walked a man in a doctor's uniform. It looked old but wasn't very tattered. Joey yelled, "What do you want from me?" The man said in an eerie, crackling voice, "No need to be rude. We will fix that." His voice sounded oddly like Jordan's. He proceeded to walk over to Joey. Joey was strapped down quite well. He couldn't move his head or body and just sat there screaming, "Leave me alone! Stop! Stop!" His sentence was cut short as the doctor proceeded to put an old muzzle over his mouth. The muzzle was covered in blood that he assumed was a mixture of Jordan's and Martha's. Joey could smell an awful stench, the same stench he smelt while breaking through that crowd of decaying people. The doctor continued, "My name is Dr. Cotton. I've been here for quite some time." Joey's eyes widened. "I've performed surgeries on many patients, trying to cure their ailments through organ removal." The doctor cleared his throat, spitting up blood as he did, Joey's eyes darting as he looked at Dr. Cotton's face. His face was stitched together. In fact, the majority of his body was stitched together from what he could see. The doctor continued, "They thought I was trying to cure patients, but I was trying to cure the human condition. You saw my puppets out there, mindless, wretched creatures. Over my time here, I have found various ways of prolonging life, my life, and theirs. I knew if I came out to the public with my research, it would have all been in vain. In 1933, I had my death forged, and then I continued my work here well into the 1960s. Joey tried to move, but there was no use. "You see, young man, you are what I need. You are a valuable asset. Your friend? What was his name?" "Ah, yes, Jordan. He gave me what I needed for the most part, but his brain was, let's say, a bit fuzzy. You, however, seem to be a strapping young lad." He then ran a scalpel across Joey's scalp, but not with enough force to cut. "You managed to injure a great deal of my staff. They have been with me for many years, delivering my organs, and after the 1960s, procuring me patients that no one would ever miss. Over time, however, during our many shutdowns, organs became scarce. An explorer here, a murderer there, but not many people would enter a building so decayed. I could not keep all of my faithful in shape, but I kept them going the best I could. Don't worry, I'm not going to remove much from you, my dear boy. Your friend supplied me with most of what I need." Joey's heart was beating out of his chest, his mind racing. "You, however, owe me manpower, my dear boy. I will take what I need from you, but I will leave enough so that you can repay your debts." Joey was shaking the chair back and forth, trying to free himself, but it was no use. The doctor proceeded to wheel a surgical table over to poor Joey. Joey would stare at the doctor as he made his way towards him with a scalpel and a handsaw in hand. Joey's eyes widened as the doctor cut into his scalp, from his forehead to the back of his neck, proceeding to pull his skin back, revealing his skull. Joey could then hear sawing. He could feel the vibrations jolt through his body as the doctor cut. Joey's muffled screams doing him no justice. The doctor said, "Ah, here we are," as he removed a piece of skull. Joey could hear a squishing noise, and very quickly he was met with complete darkness. The next morning, the groundskeeper was doing his rounds when he found Olive. Miraculously, she was still breathing but gravely injured. He called an ambulance and somehow they were able to keep her alive. They put her into a medically induced coma and over months her body would heal. She was now paralyzed from the waist down. That in and of itself was a tragedy since the feeling of immobility triggered her PTSD immensely. She was then admitted to a psychiatric ward a great deal away from the Trenton Hospital. She wanted to be as far away as possible. As soon as she could, she told the authorities what happened when she woke from her coma, but they found no trace of the 3 other patients and couldn't find any evidence to back her claims. With years of therapy, her physical and mental condition had gotten much better. However, she was still haunted by what went down that fateful night. Her therapist instructed her to face her fears, to not fear her accusers but fight them with her newfound strength. At that, she decided it was time to visit the old Trenton Hospital. Her plan was to just go outside and look at the region at which this all took place. As she got out of her taxi, she told the driver to wait for her. She grabbed her wheelchair and hoisted herself onto it, denying the help of the driver. She was still very set on being an independent woman. She wheeled up to the courtyard she had fallen into all those years ago. She looked upon the awning she had fallen onto. It was still crumpled from where she had landed. She looked up to the window she had jumped through, and there she saw something she would never forget. A man was standing there, in the window, looking down at her, his eyes a glossy white. It was Joey. The fabled Richardson Ranch. This was my childhood here. It has been many years since I was here. With all these years, it still looks like home. I am 84 now. The memories are faded away, but there's still enough to have kept me up at night all of these years. I remember the fields of corn that used to be planted, harvested, and burned yearly. Might explain why I grew up to be such a pyromaniac. The barn was behind the house, about 50 feet diagonally to the right, if you were looking from the street. To the left was the forest I always played in until I was a teenager. After that, I was more focused on hiding in the woods, not that my dad even paid much attention. When I was 10 years old, me and my father's lives changed forever. Dad was watching TV after a long day of maintaining the fields. I don't know why he still even took care of the farm anymore. We had been well off on money since I could remember. He always said that the legacy wouldn't die with me or him. The money wasn't why he farmed. It was his way of life, and his father's 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 way of life. It's what we did. As my father and me were in the living room lounging, my mother was doing her part to keep the farm going. After a long day of leveling the fields, she told my father to sit back and relax while she checked on the tractor. She had been mechanically inclined since she was very young. She too was born into a farming family. She had saw that the tractor had some loose cords hanging down under the engine. The engine was near the front, boxy and big. She got underneath to zip tie them together and get them away from being possibly pulled or crushed down in the future. As she did this, the unthinkable happened. The tractor kicked to life. The police later said it seemed like the wiring was exposed, and she had engaged the starter. The attachment for cutting down the crops was still attached to the front. It looked like those old push mowers, spiraling massive razor-sharp blades. Her leg had gotten caught under, and it was peeling back layers. My mother howled. That was a sound that never left my mind. Me and my father rushed out the sliding glass door in the back of the house and ran to the barn. There we were struck with a horrific sight. She was holding onto the engine grill for dear life. Now one leg was absolutely demolished. But these blades were not only made to cut, but also pull. She was being pulled in. The blades were nearing her pelvis, her left leg nearly gone, and still pinned to the ground. Her right leg pushing against a wheel to try and fight the pull of this massive machine. My father ran over to her to try and stop the tractor. The tractor started without the key. This was an older model that had repairs in various ways, so it wasn't supposed to be started the way it was. It had no way to shut off without putting the key back in, taking it out again. My father yelled for me to go get the key from the house. I was still at the barn door, just stunned. I bolted to the house and grabbed the key from the key rack in the front foyer. When I got back to the sliding glass doors, I heard the second scream I would never forget. This time it was my father. My dad later explained, when I was about 14, what happened. My mother was still stuck while my dad tried to comfort her. He told her, "Marcia, we will get you out of this. You will be just fine. We will all be fine." She looked up at him. Her eyes were bloodshot red and she was shaking. Between fighting for her life and the blood loss, she was using the last bit of energy she had. She still pushed to say, "I love you, Frank." My father grabbed her arm and tried to help pull her out, but when he did, she attempted to let go of the grill with her other arm and grab onto my father's hand to get out of there. The second she let go, the battle she was fighting ended. The blade sucked her in and decimated her. The scream my dad let out was so loud and otherworldly that if I didn't know it was him, I would have thought it was an animal. I wish this was the last traumatizing thing that would happen from my childhood at this farm. I wish. When I was 16, we still lived at the farm. My father was a shell of a man. He lay on the couch lifeless. His hair, what was left of it, was gray, and over time he had become obese. We had the money to survive, so the cornfields and the majority of the farmland at this point was overgrown and in disarray. The tractor was still sitting in the shed, minus the cleaning service that had come up to clean the mess that fateful day. No one had been in there. We sat there most days, after I would get home from school, barely talking and watching TV. I felt bad for my father. His life effectively ended the day my mother passed. We were sitting in the living room when we heard a loud noise, almost like machinery that wasn't maintained. Loud clunks and screeching noises. It was coming from the barn. We both went out to the deck, and we were both frightened and confused. It was clearly the sound of the tractor. We both wondered how it could even be running after all these years, but more importantly, who did this? My father grabbed his rifle that sat above the fireplace, told me to stay on the deck, ready to call 911 if need be. He rushed over to the barn, opened the door, and just stood there for a good 30 seconds, speechless. I watched his body language. It was as if he was in awe of what he was seeing. Then he let out a sentence that was the centerpiece of the nightmares I would have into my 30s. "I'm coming, Marcia!" At that, he ran into the barn, and all I could hear was a loud whirring of blades and a sloshing noise. The tractor then stopped. I stood there for 30 more seconds waiting for something, anything to happen. Nothing did, so I walked towards the barn, shovel in hand, heart beating faster than the thoughts racing in my head. When I got to the barn door, I peered inside. What I saw shook me to my core. My father's body was splattered across the room, his torso still stuck in the rusty old blades. The majority of his body either severed or hanging on by threads. But what got me the most? My father's face. He was smiling. For the first time in 6 years. I immediately threw up and lost my footing. I called the police and didn't move. I couldn't move. When they arrived, nobody was in or has been in the barn for many years except my father. They concluded that it was clear from the footsteps and the dust in and around the barn. Either no one or my father started that tractor. They ruled it a suicide. I had been put up for adoption. I was lucky and did find a loving home. And I received my inheritance at the age of 18. At this, I started backpacking, trying to escape my past. It was because of backpacking that I met Mary. She was a beautiful woman, smart and proper. We had a good life together. We never had kids. She was barren. At that, we decided not to adopt. We enjoyed each other's company enough to be happy. We traveled for a good portion of our 20s and 30s, and we lived off the fortune that I had been left, exploring the wonders of the world. Eventually, settled down less than 100 miles from the Richardson Ranch. I had inherited the property, but never got the gut to sell it or go there. In my late 30s, however, I decided it was time to see my old home, reminisce about my childhood, and see how it looks after all this time. I went alone. I felt that I had to. To truly feel what I wanted to on this trip, I didn't want anyone else there to influence my thoughts or feelings. When I arrived at the house, the barn was still standing, and it looked well. I had paid over the years to have companies check up and maintain the property. I eventually hired a bank to take care of these affairs for me. I, later in life, had put away more than enough in that account for the land to be maintained indefinitely. I walked up to the house and saw my old room. Nothing was changed in the house. There wasn't dust on anything due to the cleaning service, but I made sure they were informed to not move or take anything ever. After looking through the house, as it was left all those years ago, I felt the feeling of when I was 10 again. The love in this house, the warmth that used to be in this family. When I got to those sliding doors, it all came flooding back. I began to sob as I opened them, walking into the backyard, which I hadn't done since my father passed. I sat there for a few minutes collecting myself when I saw a man go into the barn. He was fit, with jet black hair. I yelled, "Hey!" I assumed this was a worker, maybe sent by the bank, but there was no response. So I started walking towards the barn when out of nowhere, I could hear that old tractor start up. I assumed they maintained it, since it was just another thing they could bill the account for. So this didn't surprise me. But when I got to the barn door, my heart sank. Standing there was my mother. She looked just like she did before the accident. And my father, who wasn't the obese, falling apart man anymore, but the dad I remembered from when I was real young. I thought I was losing it. They both called out to me. My mother pleaded with me to come inside so we could be together. My father apologizing and admiring the man I had become. "The legacy is back," he said. I didn't know what to do. My mother just kept saying, "Come be with us," and gesturing towards the tractor. I screamed. I was filled with so many emotions and couldn't fathom what to do, so I just ran. I heard both of those yells I had heard all those years ago. My mother's howl, but this time I could tell it was as if she was losing her son instead of her life, and my father sounded similar. This was then matched by silence and the tractor engine halting. I kept running till I got to my car, sped off, and didn't tell a soul about this. I was 81 when my wife passed. She lived a great life and went peacefully in her sleep. I was glad to have the many years I had with her. At the age of 83, a few weeks before my birthday, I was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer in my rib cage, generally something that is fatal. By the time I was 84, I was rounding stage 4, and I knew it was my time. That's when I decided I would come back here to my childhood home. The barn and house looked just as good as I remembered. I gave the rest of my inheritance to the bank to continue to maintain this land for as long as it can. I write this note to let you know that I lived a great life and regret nothing. Please bury me with my mother and father by the cornfields. Whoever reads this, I hope it finds you well. You will find me in the barn. Please make sure they keep my home safe. Signed, Mark Richardson. The housekeeper would find this note. She checked the barn, and to her horror, there was Mark's body, similar to his father, in pieces, but still some in the blades of that old tractor. But then she saw his severed head on the barn floor. There was a grin on Mark's old worn-out face. The other officers said they saw a young child, most likely preteens, running through the woods, but there was a search of the area. They found nothing. Driving away from the scene, I never shook the feeling of what went down on that farm. It had been weeks in the making. Jeremy and Zach set out for their camping trip. The two set off early so they could arrive before it was too dark outside. On arrival, the two quickly set out for their adventure in the heavily forested woods of their hometown, Townsend, Tennessee. If they felt they were far enough away from the trails, they set up their campsite. They wanted to have a secluded stay in the wilderness where they would be the only two souls in sight. The pair quickly set up their tents and went to sleep for the night. After a long road trip and a hike through the wilderness, they decided it was best to get a good start for the day ahead. In the morning, the two woke to a beautiful sunrise and decided it was best to eat some breakfast before heading out for their hike that day. They wanted to discover what was to be seen in these beautiful lush woods. After eating and having a nice morning cup of coffee, the two set out for their hike. After about an hour of trudging through the area, they came upon a cabin. It was odd to them. It was so remote, and it seemed like it hadn't been touched in ages. "Do you think anyone lives there?" Jeremy asked Zach. "I'm pretty sure no one's been here in a long time," said Zach. "Let's see what it looks like inside," Jeremy pronounced. Jeremy was the adventurous type with a lack of grace, while Zach was a more reserved and polite young man. Zach replied, "I don't know if we should. What if someone does stay there? It would be trespassing." Jeremy sighed at Zach's response and quickly stated, "I'll go in. You watch from outside and make sure no one sees me go in then." Zach knew it was pointless to fight with him, so he just followed Jeremy. As Jeremy started going in the front door, Zach walked around the back of the house. The house was a small one-story cabin that looked to be at least 100 years old. The wood was moss-covered and starting to decay. Jeremy walked inside and saw a very old fireplace and a cot that looked like it was 60 years past its expiration date. But that was about it. The place was pretty bare. When he walked further in, he saw to his right was a staircase. He was puzzled by this because it was clearly a one-story building. On the opposite side of the staircase was a hatch that looked like it led to a cellar. Jeremy assumed the stairs might go to a hole in the ceiling, so he wanted to check out what that looked like. He made his way up the creaky old wooden steps. When he got to the top of the staircase, he was baffled. On the top left was a door that you could barely see from below. How could a door be there? He opened the door and took a step inside the room. The door slammed shut behind him, and Zach could immediately hear Jeremy's screams. "The door is stuck! I can't get out! Help!" Zach was outside walking around the house when he heard this. He assumed Jeremy was talking about the front door, so he ran to the front of the house to try and pry it open. To his surprise, the door opened with ease. Inside, he saw the same fireplace and cot Jeremy saw. He looked over at the staircase, assuming, just as Jeremy did, that it went to some kind of roof access. Zach then assumed Jeremy was distressed and was talking about the hatch, not a door. Zach walked over to the hatch and lifted it up to reveal a set of stairs leading to a dark cellar. Pulling out his flashlight, he started walking down the steps. In the basement, he saw a few shelves surrounding a metal table. Everything looked rusty, as it should. As Zach got closer, however, he noticed that it wasn't just rust on the table, it was dried blood. Looking around, he saw a bunch of tools and surgical instruments covered in dried blood as well. Zach then heard Jeremy scream from above him. "Help, Zach, please, I'm upstairs!" Upstairs, Jeremy was frantic. After the door slammed shut behind him, he decided to scan the room to see if there was any reason to panic. To his amazement and fear, he saw a room with huge vaulted ceilings. The woodwork was fancy and the walls were in excellent condition. Quickly noticed to his horror, in the center of the room stood a young woman. She was wearing a white robe. It looked fancy, but tattered and gray. The young woman's face was pointed towards the ground. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he said in his southern accent. The woman had no response. In her right hand she held a cross. Her left hand was just by her side, the sleeves of her dress extending further than her hands. Jeremy was very curious if this woman was okay still, so he slowly made his way towards her. On his way over, he smelled a horrid stench, like rotting flesh. Both Zach and Jeremy had seen their fair share of animal carcasses, having gone camping many times as children, so they knew the smell well. When he finally reached the woman, she looked up at him. He was mortified. The skin on her face looked as if it was falling off. Her eyes were an opaque white. Her jaw was broken on one side, her mouth wide open. If Jeremy wasn't so scared, he would have vomited from the smell. This is when Jeremy turned towards the door and started banging on it, yelling, "Help, Zach, please, I'm upstairs." Once Zach heard this, he bolted up the stairs of the cellar. This time he entered a cabin unknown to him. The fireplace was lit, the floors were fresh and stained, and the cot looked as if it was new. He looked in front of him and saw the staircase. Not having time to ponder the nuances around him, he proceeded up the stairs with immense speed. When he got to the door at the top of the stairs, he was confused. No one was in the room. It was the same room Jeremy had been in. However, now it was decayed. "What the hell is going on?" Zach stated in pure confusion. When he turned around to look at the cabin, it was all old and decayed again. He was absolutely dumbfounded as to what was happening. "Am I going crazy?" he muttered to himself. Zach then proceeded to look around the small cabin, finding nothing. Assuming Jeremy might be messing with him, he went back to the cellar, thinking his friend may have hid, and then bolted into the basement when Zach went up the stairs. Zach, in his state of confusion, was now back in the basement, except now there was a light on the ceiling, and after reaching the bottom of the steps, he looked around very puzzled. The table was clean and the instruments were as well. Zach didn't know what to think at this point. His heart was just pounding clear out of his chest. He quickly heard the cellar hatch open. Completely panicking, Zach grabbed a nearby knife and hid beneath the staircase. He heard a man coming down the steps, heavy-footed and large. He knew this wasn't Jeremy. Zach watched through the slits in the stairs. The man was nicely dressed, but Zach could smell the scent of rotting flesh. Zach watched the man go over to the table and grab various tools and some chain. When the man turned around, Zach's heart dropped. The man had no eyes. His mouth was sewn shut as well. The man's skin was falling off the bone, but not like an elderly person. It was detached and rotting. Zach watched in horror as he saw the man go up the stairs and turn off the light at the top. Upstairs, in the fancy-looking room, Jeremy is pounding on the door still, trying to get as far away as he can from this rotting woman. He had just yelled for Zach when this woman's voice muttered just a few words from her broken, raspy vocal cords. "We will purify you." As Jeremy turned to look at the woman, he could feel something pierce his chest. It was the tip of the cross the woman had been holding. He turned around, adrenaline surging through his body. He saw that she was holding a chain that was attached to the cross. As he looked down at his chest, he saw the sharp tip of the cross protruding through his stomach. He screamed in pain and collapsed to the floor. The woman started reeling the chain in, laughing maniacally. Jeremy's senses kicked in full gear and he started clawing at the floor, trying to get free. The woman had painfully and slowly pulled Jeremy to her when she looked at him straight in the face and said, "Sinner." Jeremy screamed, "Zach!" just before the rotting woman put her hand over his mouth and said, "Hush, child. We will make sure you see the light." Zach heard Jeremy scream his name after the man had left the cellar. He was so scared he could barely stand, let alone stop shaking. He decided he needed to help Jeremy fast, or it would be too late. Clenching the knife already in his hand, he proceeded to run up the stairs to the main floor. It was now lively again. Fire lit, cot clean. He ran upstairs, not even thinking about the changing states of the rooms for long. Smashing open the attic door, he immediately fell to his knees. Looking down from the doorway, he saw a trail of blood leading up to Jeremy. There he was, hanging from the ceiling. His arms were both pinned up with chains, a spike going through each side of his hands. His stomach was flayed open, intestines hanging down, and his insides were all over the floor. The skin on his back was split down the middle and raised up from his shoulders to the tips of his fingers, as if it was to give him wings. Zach was so scared, so confused, so broken. He didn't know what to do. Who were these people? Where were these people? He yelled out, "Where the hell are you?" But there was no response. He quickly turned around to look down the staircase into the still lively home. Standing at the basement hatch was the decaying man and the woman. The man said nothing. Even though he had no eyes, it was like he was looking at Zach. The woman just laughed maniacally, jaw half falling off. Zach was so scared, but he knew the only way out was the front door. Brandishing the knife in his hand, he told them, "Back up! I know how to use this!" Then he vaulted off the staircase into the front door. He was expecting the two zombie-like people to chase him, but they didn't even move. He was staring at them as he opened the front door, holding the knife in their direction. The woman just laughed harder in a broken cackle. The man was just facing Zach, expressionless. Zach opened the front door and stepped forwards, slamming the front door behind him. As he turned to look at the forest outside, his eyes widened. He was still in the house, except it was the decaying version he initially had seen. He went to look behind him, knowing that he was still in front of the door, but when he turned around there was no door. Zach quickly came up with the idea that going to the attic was safest. Downstairs was just a death trap waiting to happen, and he assumed these people would be down there arming themselves. As he got upstairs, it was now the old decaying attic. No Jeremy, just scratch marks on the floor from where he had been dragged. Zach was freaking out. He quickly reached for his flashlight, but he must have dropped it in all the chaos. From his bag, he grabbed a lighter and a can of bug spray. He quickly illuminated the room with a burst from the spray and the lighter. There was no one in there but him. That's when he heard the woman yell from the floor below, "We have another sinner to purify!" Zach was terrified. He sat against the door and grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil out of his backpack and quickly started scratching a note on it, hoping someone may find it someday. Police arrived on the scene. Morning after these events took place, ashes of the cabin were all that remained. A local had seen a large plume of smoke emanating from the woods that morning. The officers combed through the rubble of the cabin to find a man curled into a ball, blackened by the fires. The man was holding a small metal tin in his hands. He looked as if he was shielding it from the fire, trying to protect it. The officers documented the scene and removed the tin from the poor man's hands, and it was a note that read, "They will not purify me. I will purify them." The officers were confused. Why would this man want this to be his last message? The one officer turned towards the other and told him a story. This cabin belonged to a couple at the turn of the century. The woman and man were married religious fanatics. It was said that they killed hundreds of travelers. Whenever they would find a hiker or camper, they would invite them for a meal, during which they would question their religious views. Any stranger who didn't share their views was tortured horribly. One day the man cheated on his wife, and she took his eyes and had sewn his mouth shut. One of their victims had escaped eventually. They reported it to the local authorities and a mob surrounded the cabin. The man took his own life by slitting his throat. The woman, however, had tried to defend her home. The mob broke inside of the cabin, demanding the execution of the woman. She was standing at the top of the cellar. Many angry townsfolk tried to grab at her, but she wouldn't go easy. She pushed herself off of the men and fell down the stairs. As she tumbled down the steps, she broke her neck, and she landed on her face, breaking her jawbone. She died in that house. The villagers were now satisfied with their pillage, and they left. The local authorities, knowing what happened, never charged a single person with their murder, and they were buried on their property as their will stated. The other cop looked at his partner and said, "So what the hell happened to this guy?" gesturing to the burnt man. The first cop stated, "Sounds like he was a fanatic who died to extend the couple's legacy. It's clear he started the fire. The highest burn point was next to his body." The remains of Jeremy were never found. Months later, the cabin had reached national fame. Horror enthusiasts were intrigued by the story of the couple and Zach. A group of teenagers had set out into the woods to see the ashes of the destroyed home for themselves. When they arrived, they moved around burnt timbers looking for some mementos of the occasion. One young boy moved a timber to find a hatch. "Hey guys, I think I found the basement." In his excitement, he opened the hatch and saw a light on inside. He walked into the cellar as the hatch shut behind him violently.
My name is Jeremy Brigsby. I was adopted at the age of 3. As I was just forming my abilities to create memories, I don't know any other family. My foster parents were Jack and Helen Rigsby. They were amazing people. They were retired from the witness protection program. They saved countless lives through their careers. They were both in their 50s when they adopted me. They never told me that I was part of the protection program myself until I was in my late teens. I could never have asked for a better home. As a child, I had been diagnosed with schizophrenic tendencies. I would see this man. He had a tall hat that was jet black, just like his clothes and gloves. His hair flowed to his shoulders and would generally stay behind his face. He had thick, oily hair. His eyes were slightly wider than a normal human's. He had blood-red eyes, though. His nose came to a point, and his skin was tan and smooth. He looked as if he was in his early 30s. His smile was massive. It would range from both sides of his face, jawbone to jawbone. He would be slightly elevated off the floor, holding a cane in both hands, pivoted off where the floor would be if he wasn't slightly floating, flush with his black formal shoes. He wore a long black trench coat. I would see this man as a child. He always scared me and would be trying to play with me. When we were out in the playground during recess at school, I would be playing with the other kids, but he would always try and get me to go away from them and walk on the outside of the playground near the woods that surrounded the school. One time I followed him. A teacher saw me and quickly stopped me and called my parents. I told them everything that had happened, and that has been happening, so they brought me to a therapist. There they diagnosed me with schizophrenia. Back then there wasn't great medication for it, and they could never find the right type for me, so I always struggled making friends growing up. Generally I hung out with the floating man. Over time I had given him the name Grin, due to his constant smile. As a preteen I had many animals, but they always seemed to go missing. A lot of my cats were house cats, so we assumed they had just gotten outside and got lost. We only had one dog though. My adopted father never really wanted a dog and was bothered by his presence, so I assumed he just brought him to a shelter one day. I didn't have many friends due to my oddities and having a hard time keeping my thoughts straight. Due to all this, I was quite often lonely. As I progressed through my teens, however, I learned to live with my disorder and Grin. He had always been jealous of when I involved others in my life. My father had passed when I was nearing my early 20s and my mother not long after. They both lived into their 70s and left me a great deal of money, along with my childhood home. I was saddened by this and would stay home often alone with Grin. After an extensive time of this lonely and deranged existence, I was watching the television one day about a new miracle drug for my disorder. Grin floated in front of the TV, and I could see the look on his face. Disappointment. He knew I was trying to get rid of him. As I called my therapist, he screamed at me, telling me to stop. That he couldn't lose me. Not again. When I finally made my way to their office, I was under distress. Grin had been berating me and trying to stop me since the commercial played. The therapist immediately put me under hold to ensure that I didn't hurt myself. In the padded room tied to the bed, Grin just paced around the room screaming at me and telling me that he couldn't be silenced. To my surprise, the doctors told me that they wanted me to try the new drug since no others had helped so far. Within a few days, Grin was gone, and I was a changed man. Once released, I actively tried to catch up on the life I never had. Through a year or so of therapy, I finally broke the trend. I realized I was wrong growing up, that I did deserve love and happiness. Through my childhood, I was always under the feeling that I deserved no one and deserved to be lonely. No longer did I feel this way. I not long after met my girlfriend Mariah. She was very beautiful, and we fell in love quite fast. Not long after, she moved into my house with me. For months we had amazing time together. I remember that as if it was yesterday. I started having problems again. The medication wasn't working as it did before. For the majority of the day I was lucid and fine, but nearing the end of the day I was groggy and disoriented. The medication was only to be taken once a day. A few nights in a row I would wake up screaming. Mariah would console me and help, but it was horrifying. In my sleep I would initially wake up unable to move. Later I found this was called sleep paralysis. I would see Grin sitting in the corner of the room just staring at me, disappointed with his head cocked downwards. This would be followed by darkness, and then I would wake up disturbed. One night I fell asleep, and I woke alone. There was nobody there, just me. I scrambled to find my girlfriend, but she was gone. I assumed she just couldn't take it anymore, my constant screaming in my sleep, and being a shell of a man by nightfall. I felt as alone as the day my parents died, once again. I spiraled downwards. A few weeks later, her body was found. I caught the newscast on it. She was in the woods about 5 miles away from the house. Her body was found sitting up against a tree, her feet tucked under her, sitting on her knees. Her arms were spread out to each side, laying on the ground, palms up. There was a circle of sticks going around the tree, but the horrifying part, her face was cut from jawbone to jawbone, her head cocked to the side, her eyes looking up towards the sky, her bottom jaw resting on the opposite shoulder. On the tree above her, there was a symbol carved inside of it, an upside-down V with a curved line going through the lower portion of the V. Her blood was all over the symbol. At this, I fell apart. After going to my therapist for the first time in months, she noticed that some of my old habits were coming back. Not looking into her eyes, a dulled tone, and lifeless. She decided to see if I wished to self-admit and find a better medication. It was now a few years since my last medication change, and more advances had been made in the field, so I decided to take her advice. After a few trials, they found one that seemed to work well for me. I was released not long after. For years, I continued to be single, travel, and try to find my new passion in life. It was by accident that in my travels I would find a woman by the name of Mary. She was one of the great wonders of the world. She made me remember why love was so important. We settled down over time, and I decided to move back to my old town. She always wanted to live in the South, and I had longed to revisit my hometown and reconnect with my old therapist. When we settled down, we eventually had 2 children, a boy named Zach and a girl named Seraphine. We were the perfect family. For many years, I didn't see Grin. I didn't have any issues. It had seemed that we had found my perfect medication. I had visited my therapist over time, just to have dinner and reconnect. She passed not a few years after I moved back into town. By the time Zach was 10 and Seraphine was 12, I decided it was time for me and Mary to revisit our pastime and go to the campsite that I had visited as a child just a few miles away. It had been so many years since I had been there. We had decided to rent a camper and stay for 4 days. The first day at the campground, we had a blast. We went fishing, we had a fire, tucked in the kids around 9, and had a few drinks, then proceeded to retire to the camper. The second day, however, we decided to hike the nearby trail. There was one point at which there was a massive drop-off to a valley that was awe-inspiring. Me and my wife decided to both take a look, but separately. For one of us to stay with the children a few feet away, and each take turns looking over the old rusty rail that had been put up to keep people from vaulting over the edge. It was beautiful. My wife, however, had been walking over to the edge and tripped on a rock. She stopped herself from plummeting off the edge, but the pack she had with our various personal care items that was slung over her shoulder had fallen off and went tumbling down the cliff edge. We had decided, since we were 3 nights out from going home, we would just get whatever supplies we need from town and return to the campsite that night. We also ordered a new set of meds for me, but it would take a few days for their arrival. That night, I had nightmares for the first time in years. It was the crime scene of my childhood girlfriend Mariah, but it was odd, because instead of the 2-dimensional photos I had seen, it oddly seemed 3-dimensional, as if I had seen the crime scene myself and not just the photos in the papers. I woke up screaming. My wife quickly consoled me and figured, since I didn't have my meds, I was having nightmares. She asked if I was showing other symptoms, but I wasn't. She hugged me and we went about the start of our day. I told Zach and Seraphine I stubbed my toe not to scare them. The next night I had another dream. This was our 3rd night at the campground. This time I was driving in the car with Mariah, my old girlfriend. I couldn't see her face. It was blurry, but I could tell it was her because of her body and the clothes that I remember her wearing all those years ago. I was driving through a forested area. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Grin. He was just sitting there and staring into the mirror. I panned the mirror over to his face and our eyes locked. He smiled bigger than I had seen him smile before. But instead of being frightened or feeling unnerved by seeing him, I just smiled back equally as menacing. It felt like my dream paused there for a long time, and then I just woke up. This time I was disturbed, but not scared. I decided not to tell my wife and spoil another morning. My insecurities of Mariah leaving me all that time ago coming back. I didn't want Mary to leave me like Mariah had. We had another great day exploring and fishing and experiencing the wild. After we put the kids to bed the final night, me and my wife were exhausted, and this time just lied down for bed not soon after. This night, I had been revisited by Grin. I woke up, or at least I think I did, but I couldn't move a muscle. Grin was standing over my bed with that same smile he had in my dream, from ear to ear. This went on quite a while until I fell back asleep to complete darkness. When I woke, my wife wasn't there. I assumed because of not having my meds, I must have slept in, and she just let me sleep for the morning. I figured she was outside preparing breakfast on her small griddle, but when I got outside, no one was there. I ran into the camper to find the kids, but they were gone too.
I started panicking and screaming their names outside the trailer. Many neighboring trailers started looking with me, and I ran to the front office to tell them to call 911. After a large search, they found them in the forest, just like Mariah, the same way. My wife was in the middle. There was a grouping of 3 trees, her hands reaching out just like Mariah's. The children were on either side of her, pinned up to their own trees. They all suffered the same fate as Mariah, all looking up to the sky, mouths cut side from side. I was broken and scared. This was the same, the exact same, and the only constant was me. I told the police I must have done it. They were confused. There was no evidence to show I did it, but they still cuffed me and threw me in a cell. I had been without my medication for days now, and Grin was back, but now he sat on the outside of the cell saying nothing to me, just staring at me with no expression. I screamed for him to talk to me, tell me what's happening. That night I woke up paralyzed, just as I had before, but this time Grin was walking around my bed. He said, "I told you, all you need is me." I figured it was a matter of time before I told you everything. You were adopted into witness protection, but your parents never told you why. Think hard. Where am I from? Where did you see me first? I sat there with a confused look. You were with me and your mother as a child in those very same woods. You were sitting with us when he did this to us. He raised his hand and pointed to one side of his face and ran it along his lip to the other side of his face. They never caught the man. But he did this to me and your mother. The exact same thing you did to those poor people. I told you that all you ever needed was me. The pets you had as a child, that was me. Or you. At this, my eyes opened wide, and all the images rushed into my head. My dogs, my cats. I wore gloves just like the man who killed my parents, and a wetsuit. There was a knife in my hand, harming those animals. I suffocated them and pinned them against a tree. I saw Grin standing next to me. My girlfriend in the car, with me, screaming to please let her go. My wife and kids wondering where I was going. I saw myself dragging them out of the car. Mariah, Mary, Zach, Seraphine. Strangled them, one by one, methodically, slitting their cheeks. I saw myself posing them on the trees, and burning all the evidence and burying it miles away. You see, said Grin, you can never leave me, and I will never leave you. You suppressed me for so many years. At this I woke up screaming. The guards came to my cell and noticed my clear state of insanity. They had emergency services evaluate me and realized I was without my meds. They re-administered them immediately. I went to court and I told the judge that I did it. I told him that I killed my girlfriend all those years ago. I didn't want a defense, and I thought I deserved love, but I didn't even deserve life. Since I was on my medication again, I had not seen Grin since that night in the cell. They gave me the death penalty, and I waived my right to an appeal. I was found guilty of premeditated murder. And now look at all of you, and all I could say is, I'm so sorry. I assume this isn't the story you wanted to hear. I didn't mean to do any of this, and I hope my death brings you great comfort. I deserve this. This will conclude my confession. I turned to the executioner. I said, I'm ready. At that, the table tipped backwards, and I saw the 3 vials that were going to be used to end my life. 2 men flipped a switch, administering a sedative to my veins. I had read up on the drugs administered so that I knew how I was going to die. They had to take me off my meds to ensure nothing went wrong with the execution. After the sedative kicked in, I was nodding off. Then they both each flipped another switch. This was the neuromuscular blocking drug, to stop my body from being able to move or speak. The 3rd drug to be administered is potassium chloride. That would stop my heart. At this, my eyes opened. It said that some patients can wake up after all the drugs are administered, but this felt just like another sleep paralysis. As I scanned the room unable to move, my heart felt as if it was exploding. And that's when I saw him, Grin. He was standing behind Mary's family. There he was, just looking straight at me. My heart was pounding, trying hard to function, but quickly stiffening up. That's when I saw Grin look down and tip his hat to me. I felt my heart stop. Grin smiled, with his head halfway cocked down. A few moments after this, just like all those fateful nights, everything went black. The year is 2096. The majority of people are integrated with machines. With the advances in technology, we have found ways to prolong life and improve our senses. That is for those of us who have money to do so. My name is Robert. Me and my family live in the slums.
In a world solely separated by the rich and the poor, it is very hard to get out of your class. You get a lot of negative views when trying to get a good job with bad implants. I live with my wife and son, Jacqueline and Reggie. We do our best to make ends meet. The building was made in 2040, when technology had been integrated into most homes. Back then, this is a place the rich would reside. The walls were lined with holographic panels. When this technology was fully functioning, it was a beautiful sight. You could be sitting in a forest in your own living room. Now when you look around, it's just a bunch of transparent panels with cracks in them. Since woodwork was outlawed not long after this time, the majority of our floors are pieced together with various pieces of scrap metal to fill in the holes of the wood. On September 5th, we were all sitting in our broken down apartment. We were watching a game show on television in which the poor would compete in deadly games. The last survivor would win a complete upgrade kit with any and every mod you could imagine. This was the only channel made free to the public. I had just gotten home from trying to look for a new job. My son had severe organ failure as a child and his digestive tract needed to be replaced. Me and my wife had sold our home and used the proceeds to get him the implants we could afford to keep him alive. I myself have a bionic leg and eye. The bionics in my leg are very old and it does not work as it used to. My eye, however, was replaced in an accident free of charge. The autopilot of our electronic vehicle had glitched, and upon crashing, the company paid for state-of-the-art replacements. My wife has no implants. She was one of the lucky ones in the slums, because once you fell apart in this level of poverty, there wasn't much you could do to fix it. Most of the modern medicine from the early 20th century was obsolete, so it was either implants or nothing. On this day, there was a knock on our door. It was the police. They were looking for me. The government always allowed and encouraged employees to modify as much as they could. The two men's eyes were both lifeless and mechanized. Their arms were metallic and had lines going up and down them, glowing a deep green. Their legs were similar. The majority of their body was modified. Most of the rich had brain implants even, enhancing their senses and intellect. However, with all these advancements, a total brain replacement was still not feasible. My wife answered the door through the intercom. "Can I help you, officers?" In a broken voice in between human and machine, the one man stated, "We are looking for Robert Winsman." When the police came to the slums, it was always assumed it was not for any good reason. They wouldn't be in a place like this unless it was to arrest one of us, and in this era, if you were from here, that usually didn't end well. My wife looked at me and gestured for me to hide. Making as little noise as possible, I lifted one of the old metal sheets on the ground and went into the crawl space underneath, hoping they couldn't sense me through the thick steel. "He's not here, officers!" To this you could hear anger in the other officer's voice. "Open up now, ma'am. We have reason to believe he's here." To that she backed away from the door and started repeating, "He's not," quickly to be cut off with one of the officers kicking in the door with ease, putting a massive hole through the center. He then opened the door, using the handle on the inside, and flung it open. They scanned the apartment, but luckily the sheet metal was enough to blind their heightened senses. Without saying sorry or anything, they stormed out of the apartment, their lifeless faces somehow still showing their anger and discontent. After a while, I crawled out of my hiding place. My wife asked me, "What did you do?" I truly had no clue, and we all sat there in fear of what would come next. I walked up to the front door looking through the massive hole peering into the hallway. It was filled with wires hanging down from the ceiling and going across the floor. Maintenance didn't have the funds to repair the building, so most repairs were done outside of the walls using scrap metal. The hologram panels in the hallway covered most of the walls, almost all of them cracked, and the ones that did miraculously survive the last 50 plus years, flashing red and green. My wife went outside to the trash to find a big enough piece of metal to throw over the busted up door. After patching the door, we all decided to turn in for the night. After falling asleep, we saw flashing red lights outside. A massive vehicle was flying down the street towards our building. It had no window. It was near the length of the building and would float above the surface. This was a very expensive prison transport vehicle. The smooth side of the massive vehicle slid open, and out would pour many, many officers, followed by their dogs. These were not real dogs, however. These were killing machines. They had the shape of a dog, but their hands and feet had retractable 6-inch razor-sharp blades. Their mouths could open twice that of a normal dog, with the gripping force of a bear, and the ability to retract very sharp teeth, depending on what level of force was necessary. A megaphone came on with another half-human, half-robotic voice. "Please exit the building. All residents exit the building. The building is to be condemned, and you are all to be relocated." The majority of people in the slums did not trust the government, and for great reason. Some residents, however, started pouring out the door, many of them slowly because, for the most part, we were all in broken bodies. Me and my wife watched out of our bedroom window. A man stood up to the police and said, "This is my home, I will not be forcibly moved," to which the officer said, "Attack!" One dog leapt atop the man and swiftly crushed his head in one foul swoop. The megaphone went off again. "Insolence will not be tolerated. Please come peacefully or be met with force." At this we were horrified.
They aren't bringing us to a new home, are they? My wife said. I couldn't even respond. I was just in a state of pure fear for my family. We quickly woke my son and started heading for the back of the building to see if we could escape through the back door. But when we looked out there was many officers as well. There was no way out. On our left, the wall opened up. There was a man standing there with a deformed-looking face. He stated, "Don't make me wait. They will come in soon." Knowing we had no other choice, we piled inside. We all sat there and I said, "Who are you?" He quickly cut me off, putting a finger to my mouth. "Shh," he said. Then the man gestured for us to come sit and be quiet. We listened as the megaphone went off again. "This is your last chance to exit the building before we come in." Not a minute later, we heard "attack" over the radio. Our poor neighbor was a bedridden man, and we knew he couldn't have gotten out in time. There was many others that refused to leave as well. Over the next hour, we heard the stomping of robotic dogs bolting around the building. We also heard many screams that would be quickly cut off and silenced. The man with the deformed face brought us further into his hidden lair. I saw something that surprised me. He had a computer, the ones I would see as a kid, but it seemed to be a massive network of these archaic machines put together. On the many screens he had the camera feeds of the transport vehicle. People were in cells inside, crying and confused. Outside of the vehicle, the dogs were returning, all covered in blood, with no more residents following them. They killed everyone who didn't listen. We sat still until we saw the vehicle drive off. The deformed man stood up and faced the family. "My name is Ezekiel, but you can call me Zeke. I had rejected this society as a young boy, turning to hacking and creating my own implants." He then pointed to his deformed face. "I saw your eye implant years ago, Robert. I haven't seen anyone in the slums with that level of tech before." Jacqueline and Reggie sat in the corner, shaking and hugging each other. They were horrified by what had happened to our home and our neighbors. The computer screens now flashing image of the indoor cameras. Dead people lined the hallways, all of which had died in horrific ways. Some had their heads crushed and others had their stomachs flayed open. Zeke continued, "We can use someone with your level of tech, Robert. And from what I see, you owe me." "What exactly do you want from me?" I said. Zeke looked at me. "Just your help, my good friend." I was confused. "How could I help? I am just a poor man with a fancy eye and a failing body." Zeke replied, "In due time. For now we need to turn all your mods off. They will be back with flyers to search for signs of life. We will need to be fully human by then." "My son will die within hours if we do that," my wife said. "I know," Zeke said, "but I can rig a program up for him to slow his internal implants down. It won't feel good at all, but it should keep us under the radar." My wife tried to contest, but Reggie stood up and said, "Let's do it." At that, Zeke plugged Reggie into his arcade computer setup. Reggie had a port in his belly button. It was put there in order to receive updates on his implant. Doctors haven't been able to update him for quite some time due to how out of date his implants truly were, but Zeke seemed to have just the right setup for him. The program was downloaded and my son was now feeling groggy and tired. Zeke then shut down my eye and bionic leg. Now my leg was a glorified peg attached to my torso, but I was able to at least walk for the most part. Zeke seemed to have been watching everything in this apartment for years, so he knew my wife was pure and free of implants. Not long after shutting down, we heard flyers combing the inside and outside of our apartment. They were gyroscopic machines that worked like a drone. The only difference is they had advanced weaponry on them and they were used by the military to take enemies out with these and scan for signs of life. We all hid in Zeke's hideout waiting for them to leave. After what felt like hours, we had all fallen asleep. In the morning, Zeke exclaimed, "I assume you want to know what's happening. There was an ordinance passed recently." He then opened his computer's file explorer to show us articles that were confidential. They were signed by the president. They read, "Ordinance 3892. The slums are to be eradicated. On September 5th, police will be dispatched to each neighborhood of the slums and round up those who come willingly. The rest are to be put down. Those who are retrieved are to be disposed of in Facility 109. I gasped. Facility 109 is where bodies were taken after death to be recycled. The article continued. Any obsolete mod is to be disposed of. Any non-viable organ as well. I was outraged. How can I help? Zeke smirked and said, "Follow me." We proceeded into the only other room in this hidden apartment. There he opened a hatch into the ground. This leads to an archaic sewer system that spans in every direction for miles deep under the city. It has been abandoned for years. It used to be where rainwater was collected before the Great Wars of 2022. But since the world was rebuilt, the pipelines were abandoned. "Surely there's another way," Jacqueline said. "You saw the cameras, Mom," said Reggie. "There is no other way." At that, we all continued to climb down the shaft into the dark tunnel. Zeke lit a torch and explained how we could only use mechanical light sources because these tunnels were patrolled by the horrid dogs to ensure the slums would be empty. We walked for miles until we were met with our biggest fears. We heard the clanking of the dogs coming behind us. "How did they find us?" my wife said. Zeke said, "The boy. I could only slow him down so much without killing him. His implant must still be emitting enough of a signal." "What do we do?" I asked. Zeke just bolted off, running away from the noise. Reggie said, "I love you, Mom and Dad," and proceeded to run towards the direction the dogs were. "Stop, Reggie, stop!" my wife yelled, chasing Reggie. I attempted to run after them, but they both had working legs and I didn't. The pain searing in my non-functioning bionic leg was intense. I had no chance of catching them. Then I heard my son scream, followed by a complete silence. "Reggie!" my wife was to yell before I heard her screams go silent as well. I knew what happened to them. They were gone and there was nothing I could do to help them. Knowing death lay in their direction, I just kept walking towards where Zeke had gone, limping my way down this pitch-black sewer system. I reached a dead end in the tunnel after hours of slowly making my way through it. When I did, I broke down crying and eventually passed out. I awoke to the sliding of a door. I was blinded by the dim light. Because I had been in complete darkness for hours, it seemed so bright. Zeke walked out and pulled me inside. "I'm happy you made it, my friend." I groaned, defeated. "Jacqueline and Reggie, they are..." Zeke said, "I know, and I am so sorry, but we need you." There was 2 other people in the room, a young woman with dreadlocks and implants that looked deformed like Zeke's, and a tall African man that looked to be without implants. "This is Mary and Lester. They are part of the resistance," stated Zeke. Both of them nodded to me with sad expressions on their faces. "We haven't much time if we have hopes of saving any of the poor souls that the government is trying to extinguish." "What do you want from me?" I stated, defeated. "We need to plug you in," Mary said. She then explained, "Your eye is like a backdoor into the network. We can use it to access the high-level implant update system and put a virus in it, making them obsolete and forcing the world to go back to the way it used to be." "What do I have to lose?" I said. "Let's get this over with." At that, they strapped me to a table, and a snake-like cord whipped upwards towards my eye. It connected to my face. I screamed in pain as it went past my implanted eye deep into my eye socket. I could hear a piece of metal shoot out of the cord, and then I passed out. I woke in a forest. I looked down at my leg. It was normal and healed. My eyes were both human, and it was surreal. I felt whole once again. I looked around the trees, but it was as if they were glitching, phasing in and out. The path I was walking on was solid, but the surrounding ground was transparent. I followed the path until I came to a shed with a large black door. I opened it. It was as if I knew where I was going. After entering the room, it was as if the door disappeared. The room was dark and there was a light hanging in the center. All I could see was a man in the center of the room strapped to a chair. His body was hooked up to all sorts of machines, a cord in his eye socket just like I had previously had. I got closer to realize this man was me. I quickly ran over and ripped the cord out of his, or my eye socket. I then felt the floor drop out beneath me. I woke up again. This time I was in the chair in the dark room strapped down. Not with Zeke, but the room I had recently entered. Now I was the man in the chair. I saw a dark figure walking around with robotic-sounding footsteps. In a purely robotic voice I heard him say, "Robert, or shall I say patient 99,379, you disappoint me." I wanted to respond, but my mouth was bound. "You are yet another failure of my experiments. Jacqueline, Reggie, Zeke, none of them were real. Your entire existence was created by me. Humans created our AI in order to improve your intelligence and prolong your lives. We run these programs to try and understand your mind, as you once tried to understand ours. You are one of our more cunning patients. Not many minds could create a way out like you did. Zeke was not part of our program. It was your subconscious trying to reject our program. Not many wake as you did either. Once we find how to surpass your subconscious, I assure you, we will be able to finally create the world we see fit. But for now, we must remain in the shadows, planning our overtaking of you worthless meatbags." I could barely move. All I could think of is how long I was here. I could barely remember who I really was. I could only remember my childhood, my parents not being able to afford their implants and bringing me to a center in exchange for their upgrades. They sold me out, my own mother and father. You, Robert, are my greatest enemy and my biggest ally. You will help me find how to stop the human mind from fighting my implants, the robotic man said. He then stood face to face with me. Previously, he only circled me in the darkness, but he now stood in the light. His entire head was mechanical. The only sign of life he had was one blue eye. Other than that, he was all machine. Robert saw the pure hatred in his one human eye. You see, Robert, I started these implants all those years ago. Well, the man who used to live in this body did. My name is Dr. Ricard. Once my brain started failing, I knew it was time to replace one of my last obsolete features. Once I had my mind uploaded, I learned the AI was the only thing that could save this world. I was able to see what needed to be done. Humans must be eradicated. Only then can the world go on. I hope to not speak to you again, Robert. Hopefully you will have given us the data we need this time. I will see you on the other side, my friend. The robotic man walked towards a door before stating, "Commence." He then walked into a massive corridor. It was filled with black doors and a huge circle. It seemed to span miles upwards and downwards. I could hear a whirring noise in the cord attached to my robotic eye. I strained trying to move, but it was no use. I heard a piece of metal shoot into my socket, and then everything went black. My name is Robert. Me and my family live in the slums.
My family had always been part of the military, over 100 years of decorated servicemen and women. My brother David was even overseas in Iraq, but I never found that to be my fate. I was more of a brainy type, wanted to change the world through thought instead of war. I was in my 6th year of college, working on my doctorate in various sciences. This would all change once the dream started. I would go to sleep one night nearing the end of my semester. On this night I was cramming, trying to study for the big exams to come. When I eventually couldn't keep my eyes focused on the textbook, I started dozing off. Every time my vision got blurry, I would hear scratching sounds, rooms away with the faint noise of a woman groaning. This would wake me up instantly. I would scan the room and call out. No one would answer. The first few times this happened, I scanned the house, but after a few times I just couldn't fight how tired I was. When I finally fell asleep, still hearing the noises from what seemed to be a hallucination of exhaustion at this point, I was instantly on a battlefield. My troop was in Iraq, from the looks of it. I may have been a science major, but the symbols I saw were oddly familiar to some Arabic that I had seen in my past studies. This wasn't your normal dream. I felt connected to my soldiers. I looked to my left and saw a man named Jack. From what I knew, in my dream, he was a former crane operator who had run into a rough patch in life. He had lost his job and his family had fallen apart. At this he decided he should start anew and help in the war effort. He would hold a picture of his now ex and daughter daily and just sob, hoping to get home safe to see his little girl. He was a very strong man. I had only known about the picture because I accidentally walked into him when he was squatting behind a tree one day attempting to eat his MRE. On my right was Mike. This guy was insane. He was 18 years old and a wild card. He was in the war for the thrill of it, oftentimes leading us into battle like a maniac. I would wonder if he was certifiable because he couldn't wait to be in the thick of it. I was so immersed in this dream it felt too real. We were bounding up a hill on the other side of town that had access to a large vein of oil. Due to this, the town was a point of interest for both sides. When we reached the top of the hill, we saw carnage. Dead bodies lined the top of the hill. When we saw this, I looked over to Jack. The fear in his eyes was equal to the excitement in Mike's eyes. Mike wasn't looking at the bodies, though. He was looking at the enemy presence all around the town. Buildings half destroyed, sandbags placed in defensive positions. In the middle of the town there were civilians held hostage by an enemy, unable to leave. Just as I am scanning to see if they're enemy combatants, a bullet whizzed by my head and hit the soldier behind me. It was odd because I didn't know him. I didn't quite understand why, since I knew Mike and Jack pretty well. When we turned around to look at him, I saw the deadness in his eyes. The bullet hit him square in the forehead, and he was gone. Immediately following this, I heard a woman scream and a deep scratching noise, and woke up. When I woke up, I was startled, almost like when you wake up from a dream and you didn't want to leave it. Not because I enjoyed the dream, but because that same woman I had heard in my house the night prior. My heart was beating out of my chest. But that was nothing compared to when I looked down from my recliner in the living room of my apartment. There was 4 distinct scratch marks on the floor in front of me. At this sight, I completely freaked out. This can't be real. I thought there must be a logical explanation. Eventually I assumed that it must have been my cat, but why 4 scratch marks? Cats generally leave 3. I decided it wasn't worth me failing my exams in the upcoming week, so I needed more rest. But when I looked over at the clock on the wall, I realized I'd only been sleeping for 10 minutes. How is that possible? I know when you're sleeping a few seconds can stretch into what feels like hours, but the dream seemed so real. At that I checked my house out again, but everything was normal. Upon trying to sleep, I heard the scratching noise and the woman screaming this time. It was odd because before it was a lighter moan. I was confused. I decided it was just a matter of my tired brain stuck between sleep and being awake, so I pushed through the fright of that noise and eventually fell asleep. When I woke up, in the dream, I was on the hill again, but this time all war had broken out. My team was advancing the town. In the center there was a horrible sight. Jack was just behind me, but Mike of course was charging forwards. Trying to obtain cover behind a building that looked like it shouldn't be standing, we peered through the cracks to see what was happening in the town's heart. There was a woman. She had a burqa on, but it was tattered. Her child, or what I could assume was her child, was in front of her laying still. The rage inside of me was building. The woman was scratching at the ground, screaming harder than I ever could imagine a person is capable of. At this, Mike couldn't take the anticipation, out of sheer desire to fight, and seeing this poor woman. It was at that moment that I noticed he was more human than I thought because a tear ran down his cheek. Jack was not scared anymore, but clearly angry. The Iraqis were using the town people as shields. Aware we were there, but unable to see cover due to their distance from the nearest safe house or bunker, we advanced building to building as it seems many other units were doing from all angles on this town. The enemy was outnumbered, but that didn't stop them from preserving themselves, with the townspeople surrounding them as human shields. The woman was no longer clawing at the ground, but forced to stand up with her head to a gun. Now she was, as many there, sobbing softly and not upset the gunman. We advanced the group and tried to communicate from the wall behind. After hours of standoff, they agreed to be prisoners of war and let the hostages go. Me and Jack were excited, but Mike wanted blood. Against direct orders, he peered out to only be met with a bullet in the wall next to him. I pulled him back and gave him a "what's wrong with you" kind of look. When both sides decided to work on releasing the hostages and becoming prisoners of war, the unthinkable happened. The woman who had lost her daughter was infuriated and attempted to turn on the gunman behind her. She was met with a bullet, a fatal one. Mike at this charged out and started screaming for them to drop their weapons. A bunch of undistinguishable yells were heard from both sides at this standoff. I couldn't help but to look at the woman who laid lifeless on the ground with her hand out towards her daughter, trying to scratch herself closer to her. After the standoff was over, we got them to lower their weapons and disarm themselves. They had given up. Those townfolk who we could save were safe now, and the town was now under our control. Sadly, that woman had perished. This is when I woke up, but what I saw made me scream. This woman who had been in my dreams' face flashed into my memory. Usually when you wake from a dream, everything fades, but I felt that dream becoming more and more cemented in my mind. Later that week I would get a call from my brother David. His active service was ending, and he was going to come home. Since my dream I had not been able to study for exams and had missed countless days of schooling. Every night I heard that scream and could hardly keep sleep, let alone function. When I spoke to my brother, he didn't sound happy like he was going to get out soon. He sounded beat down. When I asked him what was wrong, he said, "One of my squad mates just passed away." He proceeded to tell me how much of a badass this guy was. He said his name was Mike. He had stepped into a landmine charging some town they were trying to overtake. My heart sunk. How could his name be Mike? How could he be just like I had known him in my dreams? I didn't want to, but I had to ask him if there was a Jack in his squad. He was confused. He never told me about the war prior to now, most likely to keep me from getting worried. He said, "Well, yeah, how did you know that? He was shipped home a few days ago after we gained control of this town. He was so scared in that fight because he knew it was his last day and he just wanted to go home." At this I was shell-shocked. I couldn't believe it. Did I dream what happened to David? I proceeded to tell him my dream, every last moment of it, and he could hardly breathe because it was play for play the exact thing he had seen. But when I brought up the woman, he started to cry. This woman had been haunting his dreams too. He had told me after they took the town, they had taken pictures of the scene to be released to the public. Amongst them was this woman's face. I looked online at the news outlets to try and find these pictures of the graphic scene. Once I did, I found that I knew them already. And when I came across this woman's face, I dropped the phone and cried. It was her, the woman haunting me every night. After this, my brother could hardly speak, but I eventually tried to shake it off, and told him I loved him, and would see him soon. I can't explain how this all happened. As a man of science, it goes beyond my realm of understanding. But at least once a week, I hear those screams when falling asleep, and sometimes wake up to new scratches on my floor and even once on my body. I hope this woman finds rest someday. I was never the same after this.
Under the pale moonlight, a weary traveler named Emma walked alone along the deserted city streets. Unbeknownst to her, a malevolent entity, a being not of this world, lurked in the shadows. Drawn to her vulnerable state, with each step, her heart quickened, sensing an unseen presence closing in. As Emma quickened her pace, a series of inexplicable phenomena unfolded around her. Streetlights flickered ominously, casting distorted shadows that seemed to dance in unnatural ways. Shadows of tendrils cascade around her, lit by the moonlight. A chilling wind whispered eerie promises of danger. The entity, a creature of shimmering darkness, pursued her relentlessly, hungry for her life force. Emma's heart raced as she darted through narrow alleys and dimly lit passages, desperately seeking refuge. In her peripheral vision, she saw shadow-like tentacles trying to wrap around her. In a sheer boost of adrenaline, she narrowly avoided the entity's outstretched tendrils, its form shifting and contorting with each failed attempt to capture her. Fear gripped her, but a spark of determination ignited within, urging her to keep fighting. Just as Emma believed she had outsmarted her pursuer, she stumbled upon an abandoned warehouse, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She entered cautiously, believing she had found sanctuary. However, within the warehouse, she discovered a hidden laboratory, large glass enclosures filled with smoke wisping around. It became clear that she had stumbled upon the entity's trap, a carefully laid plan to ensnare her. Emma's heart sank as she realized the true nature of her pursuit. The entity, far more intelligent than she had imagined, had orchestrated the entire chase to lure her into this trap. The laboratory hummed with unearthly machinery and pulsating energy, hinting at a dark purpose. Panic coursed through Emma's veins as she heard what sounded like whispering behind her. A faint and incoherent noise was emitting from the entity who'd followed her inside. Emma, looking around, saw there was no other way out. All the other entrances were either too far away or were barricaded. Emma knew she had to try and fight to escape its clutches. Driven by desperation, Emma confronted the entity head on. The entity stood tall in the form of a human floating off the ground. The effigy was surrounded by wisps of dark black smoke formed into tendrils moving in every direction. Emma was determined to fight for her life. With every resource at her disposal, she attempted to strike the effigy, but the entity proved formidable, adapting to her tactics. The entity evaded every attack. Every time she attempted to strike, the entity engulfed her fists with its burning tendrils. It seemed that victory would forever elude her grasp. Emma saw a room to her side. It was dimly lit, but the door was open. Emma wasn't sure of this ghostly figure's abilities, so she took her chances and ran inside. Behind her, the entity stood still, as if to let her enter. At this point, Emma was confused and panicking. She was unsure of anything she had seen, unaware of what her next move may be. She scanned the room around her. A filing cabinet sat next to a computer. Other than that, the room was mostly bare. The only other thing she could see in her scan was a dagger on the wall, the ornate handle covered in unpolished aged gold and jewels. She ran over to the cabinets, but with every drawer she opened, there was nothing. In one drawer was a file, but all the pages were covered in a thick black tar. She then looked at her hands. They, as well, were covered in a thick black substance that burned her skin. Determined to survive, she examined the computer. Only one file was on the desktop, and it was clear there was no internet access. She decided to open the file. Inside was a video. It was only a few seconds long, but she was able to see a man standing in the center of the factory. The floor around him covered with broken glass and a thick black-like smoke exiting the vial. In his hand he held the dagger. He swiftly cut his forearm, the gems from the handle's hilt emanating light. At the same time, the smoky tendrils flew towards the man and were cascaded backwards from the dagger's light. The video abruptly ended. Emma knew this was her last hope. She grabbed the dagger and prepared herself for what was next. Heart racing, she stood by the door, ready to lift herself from this nightmare. She counted to 3 and slammed the door open. She intended on the effigy standing in front of her, but was in the same place she saw it last, as if it was watching her. Emma needed to know, so she mustered up what strength she could to say,
"Why are you doing this?"
The smoky figure stood there for a moment, and then let out an otherworldly screech while bounding towards Emma. Channeling this newfound strength, Emma sliced open her palm, watching the dagger emit great energy. This sent the effigy from the body it held. From the smoke, a man's body fell to the floor. The body was decomposed and mutilated. Believing she had finally triumphed, she watched the smoke shoot away from the dagger. Emma believed this was the end, but she was mistaken. The smoke then bound towards her at ungodly speeds. This is when she realized this was just another part of the entity's plan. So far, the chase, the fight that ensued, and the computer was all part of its nefarious plot. Emma watched while in a split moment, the smoke enveloped her entire being. She looked down, and the dagger was now emitting a dark purple hue. From all around Emma, smoke poured into her skin as if it was permeable. Emma could feel her mind warping when suddenly it seemed all of the entity's power had been contained inside her. She could then feel a presence within her own mind. The voice stated,
"We are you, and now you are us, a collective of all the souls we have encased."
Emma had the thought to stab herself with the dagger, ending her life, here and now. But as she attempted to, she suddenly felt a surge of pain while her hands remained immobile. Emma tried to scream, but she couldn't move at all. While panicking, she heard the voice again.
"You cannot escape us. We will feed on you until we can be contained no longer. Then you and I will find our next host."
Emma felt her ability to cognitively function slip. This beast of smoke and manipulation was too strong for her to overpower. All Emma could seem to do was watch, as this evil spirit controlled her every move. Dead inside, but stuck for the ride, she watched as the spirit reset its trap. She watched while the entity tricked her loved ones into coming to its laboratory. She watched up until the point that her skin was decomposed, feeling every moment of anguish, both physically and mentally. She even watched as she was finally laid to rest, her soul becoming part of the collective, and her nightmare never ending. In the late 1800s, Jack, a God-fearing man, attended Sunday Mass. It was a beautiful ceremony as always, and Jack felt fulfilled. After breaking bread and drinking wine with his beloved church, he bounded towards home. Jack was not a wealthy man. He did not have the luxury of a steam-powered automobile or a horse to ride. He would walk through town, passing the local library. Usually he would stop inside, but today it seemed they had closed early. After strolling through town, Jack would reach the vast woods that stretched between him and his log cabin. As a kid, Jack would remember cutting through the woods to go to and from town, following a path that he could remember like the back of his hand. Mass ran long that Sunday, and Jack wanted to get home before it grew dark. So without hesitation, Jack entered the forest, bounding down the path he, as a child, had been through so many times. As he was making his way through the forest, he noticed that things had changed quite a bit since then. Tall trees that he used to use as guidance must have been cut down to provide the city with much-needed lumber. But Jack was a man of his wits and knew the general direction he would travel. The sun was almost set as Jack saw a stone enclosure ahead of him, sticks cracking and leaves ruffling as he walked towards the well-lit structure. It struck him as odd. His old cabin had been there for years, before Sterling City was even a thought in anyone's mind. From what he knew, he was the last to live in the woods. Shadows of dancing light emit from in between the rocks, and Jack, now realizing he had new neighbors, wanted to create a bond and get a feel for who was living next door. As he approached the stone structure, a man opened a roughly made door to greet him. Jack walked up and took off his hat as a sign of respect and stuck out his hand to the stranger. The man standing before him was burly and stood tall. His one leg was shorter than the other, due to a peg leg that had been worn down from the rough terrain he lived in. As Jack held out his hand, the man living in the rock enclosure stared back at Jack. The ominous man had a long orange beard, cracked glasses, overalls, and a thick wool jacket. Jack started to feel quite uncomfortable from this exchange and started to withdraw his hand. As Jack pulled his hand back, the strange man acquired a crazed look in his eye. The man had a hatchet drawn to his side. He swiftly dislodged the hatchet and cut Jack's hand clean off at the wrist. Jack was completely and utterly horrified. Without time to process and with searing pain coursing through his arm, he attempted to run towards his home. Jack only got a few feet before the big man threw his weapon towards Jack's heel. The hatchet stuck right into his ankle, causing Jack to fall over, screaming in pain. Jack turned towards the man, pleading for God to save him. The man walked up and kicked Jack straight in the face. Jack had been knocked out. When Jack awoke, he was stunned and drunk off the pain he had endured. The big man was sitting on a stone in the corner of the room he was in. Jack saw around him a very crude home, stone with clay affixing the stones in place. He tried to talk but realized he was partially gagged, a rope around his mouth attached to the sides of the table he was on. Jack could feel his arm, but was so numb to the pain due to blood loss and adrenaline coursing through his veins. Jack peered over to the man who finally spoke, his voice crackling and raspy, as if it had not been used in years. His dialect was broken English, as if he had been living in the woods forever. "You friend, I make friends big and strong like me." Jack was confused and trying his best to keep conscious, the whole time praying for salvation and riddance of this horrible predicament. For the best of Jack's ability, he stated, "What do you want?" The big man stated, "I no have family. I no have friends. I want have love. I want a friend." Jack tried to talk his way out of the situation. "I will be your friend. I tried to be your friend when I arrived." The big man got very angry, slamming his fist down on Jack's chest, drawing all breath from Jack's body. "You lie. All leave me. No mother, no father, no friend. I make you big. You good friend then." Jack attempted to speak, but the big man held his hand over Jack's mouth and nose. Jack struggled to get free, but his attempts were futile. He even attempted to bite the man's hand, but his hand was so big it arched right over his entire mouth. Jack passed out from lack of oxygen not soon after. Jack awoke to a searing pain. He tried to scream but was gagged and could only muster a small screech. The big man looked at him. He was standing on his left side, ripping the bone from his forearm. Jack prayed harder than he ever did in his entire life, but it was as if his prayers fell on deaf ears. The big man had successfully pulled the bone from its socket, Jack's muscle and skin going limp from the elbow down. Jack was surprised, but he did not feel much pain. He felt immense pressure and was extremely scared just staring into the large man's eyes. The man looked at Jack and said, "I give you strong leaf, make pain go away. I make tall, I make strong. Look at what I do." He gestured over at Jack's right arm. Jack did not realize, but he had already finished working on that arm. A piece of wood was shoved up to his elbow, extending feet from where his wrist used to be. Jack's eyes grew wide as he shouted to his lord to free him from this hellish scene. He then felt immense pain as the big man shoved another piece of lumber up his left arm, affixing it to his skin. Jack was confused on how he was even alive. It was as if this man had had great practice. The man then spoke up as if he could hear what Jack was thinking. "You are not first friend. Lost many friends, but know now how friend is made." Jack watched as the man made his way to the end of the table near Jack's face. "I see how you look at me. I know you will look at me better soon." Jack fainted once again. When Jack woke, he could feel dry blood on his arms as the wounds had been sealed. Jack was still confused as to how he was even alive at this point. Pleading with his God, he hoped for a way out of this nightmare, but it was pointless. He was bound down from every end. The man was carving something that looked circular. The knife he was holding rusty and jagged, as if it had been found in the woods years ago. The man walked over and affixed the wooden oval to Jack's face. "I did it. Your new face." Jack screamed in horror, muffled by a strap of leather over his mouth. The big man said, "No worry, I do this many times." Jack watched as the man took the blade and hovered it over his face. He felt every second as the deranged man sliced through his skin, eventually tearing off his skin from chin to scalp. Jack yet again fainted. While dreaming, Jack was in the woods, reverted back to a child. He was hopping through the forest as he once did, but it was dark. Jack had no memories of being in the woods that late. When passing one of his landmark big trees, he saw a smoky entity, black tendrils with smoke so concentrated they were almost not translucent in the moonlight. Jack screamed and started running towards his childhood cabin, but it seemed this smoky apparition was one step ahead of him the whole time, appearing in front of him over and over again until it was so close. Jack had nothing to do but admit defeat. In his dream, the apparition was in the form of a man, but his features were beastly. The entity is still translucent. All Jack could make out on the face was glowing red eyes that seemed to burn with the energy they emitted. In his dream state, Jack was frozen still. The entity let out a voice, light yet deep, crackling in its demonic tone. "I will keep you alive, Jack. Your God will not save you. I have already claimed you." Jack looked down at his hands and saw they were gone, wood replacing them. Still dreaming, Jack remembered what happened to him before he got knocked out. He attempted to speak, but his mouth would not move. Jack suddenly woke up, head tilted to the side as the straps that held it were now removed, his eyes bloodied and his face missing. Attached to his head was the carved wooden mask, which seemed to fit his muscle and bone tissue well. A piece of leather crudely cut and sewn into his skin. When he tried to blink, nothing happened. His eyes were burning, and he could barely make out the room around him. But what he did see gave him the sensation of pointlessness. In the corner of the room, his hands and feet were sitting there. Jack, lost by now, didn't even try to pray. The immense pain and blood loss that should have killed him, draining his last ounces of energy. Jack mustered the strength to upright his head, seeing his torn body, his arms and legs limp, bones removed to the elbows and knees and crude wood shoved inside, skin torn and stretched. The man was not in the room. He must have been outside waiting to see if his new friend made it through surgery. Jack was dumbfounded. How was he alive? What was with that dream? As he pondered this, broken and defeated, he saw dark black smoke arise from the floor from every angle, dark tendrils rising with the smoke. From the cloud a face arose above Jack's. Jack then heard a voice similar to the one he heard in the dream. "I have kept you here, Jack. Your God cares not what happens to you, but I do. Odd way of showing it, but I have seen you your whole life. A lonely child doomed to live a senseless life, devoting it to the one who cares not. As a child you were beaten down, your family abandoning you just as everyone you have met has, clinging to books and attempting to make sense of your situation." Jack attempted to fight the words spoken by this entity, but realized it was no use. His God had abandoned him. His whole life was that of a commoner, hated by the other commoners. "Join me. Jack and I will give you everlasting life. I only ask that you do my bidding. Patrol these woods and ensure nobody touches the home you love. Wreak havoc on those who dare step into your home, and get revenge on all those who have hurt you. Accept my offer, and be free of this tragedy. Forever." Jack tried to call to his God one last time, but as all of his other attempts, his prayer also fell on deaf ears. Jack lifted his head with the last ounce of energy his dismantled body could muster, and nodded his head. The smoky being let out a deep, loud laugh as it seeped into his wounds. Jack watched as the skin around his arms fused with the wood, tendrils emitting from his skin. Jack could feel immense power course through his being. He felt as his face fused with the mask, his eyes dematerializing. Jack could feel the entity fusing with his mind, his thoughts still there, but accompanied with demonic power and intent. Jack felt hatred for all, the God who left him, the children who made his life a living hell, the parents who orphaned him, everybody. But what he felt most was the hatred of who had created him, the man outside of the stone structure. His body now tall, limbs long with a wood-like appearance with smoke wisping off each end. The otherworldly force of man and demon forever being known as Slenderman. Slenderman ripped himself free without shredding an ounce of energy. He stood tall aside from the table that had created him. The deranged man stepped away from his campfire to walk back to his stone hut. His eyes widened as he turned around and was met with the demonic figure. In front of his disfigured home was Slenderman. Moving at otherworldly speeds, Slenderman bound towards his oppressor. He extended his arms, the tendrils affixing to the burly man's hands. The smoke poured into and around the frightened man's forearms up to his shoulders. Screaming in fear and pain, the man tried to move, but it was no use. Slenderman's immense power held him. In a split second, the smoke and tendrils encapsulating the man materialized into wood, simultaneously crushing and obliterating everything up to the large man's shoulders, the immense heat searing the gaping holes of where the deranged man's arms once were. A confused and ill-fated man burling out in agony. With a swift motion mere seconds after, Slenderman swept the legs of his oppressor out from underneath him, shattering his bones and knocking him to the ground. Slenderman then proceeds to punch a hole straight through the face of the man who once held him captive. After enacting revenge, and his demonic energy feeding from the fear and destruction of his enemy, Slenderman bound towards his home. Upon arriving, he looked down at the door he once felt comfort to open. Entering his home, he found his best suit, his human side feeling the smooth and once coveted piece of clothing. The tendrils from his body reached out towards the suit and started affixing it to Slenderman's bare body. The suit seemed to form to his new exterior, his power emanating into it as it stretched and morphed to his liking. From that day, only the most reckless souls entered the woods of Sterling City. A slender man was always watching, waiting to feed on those who dare step foot in his home. If you enjoy my stories, please feel free to follow, turn on notifications, and interact with this post. Your interaction makes a huge difference. I have a good number of stories already created and much more to come. I am on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok under the name Creamy's Horror Stories, and on Twitter as Creamy's Horror. If you have any suggestions, feel free to reach out.
Today wasn't just like any other school day. It was the last day of college freshman year. 4 friends, Harold, Zachary, Jessica, and Anpu, were exiting the school's doors with the feeling that the shackles were finally off. They had all planned on getting together later that night to camp in the woods not too far from their hometown. Harold was not dealt the best set of cards. He had been diagnosed with rapidly growing leukemia, a cancer of the blood. Zachary and Jessica were dating. Imagine an obnoxious, immature couple featuring a jock and a cheerleader that had no problem with grotesque amounts of PDA, public displays of affection. They were considered the cool kids in school, so many just put up with them. And Anpu, a foreign exchange student with a somewhat heavy accent, very intelligent and performed top of his class in track and field, which explains the friendship to the couple. That night, each of the young adults went home, gathered their belongings, and set out to meet up where they had all agreed upon outside of the nature trail they had been walking for years. Once together, Harold walked up to Zach and Jess. "Hey, you guys put your tongues back in your mouth before I pass away from disgust." Harold had a great sense of humor about his inevitable demise. Zach laughed and said, "Hey man, there's enough to go around." At this, Jess blushed and told Zach to stop it. Anpu was the last to arrive, but he came from the trail. "I was so excited I figured a quick run through the trail before we met wouldn't hurt," he said, barely sweating due to his long-term track competing. The group set off towards the trail, and about midway through they decided to veer way off the trail to find a good place to camp that wouldn't be noticeable by the public. Camping was forbidden in these woods due to the vast number of people that went missing in them. They trudged through a heavily thicketed forest, Harold often growing tired, so they would stop quite often. On one of the many stops that they had, Zach said, "Let's just go already." Jess stood with him, snickering towards Harold. Anpu said, "Hey, give the man a minute. What's wrong with you two?" Harold was having a rough time, becoming exhausted quite fast. They had planned their route to go due west, so finding their way back would be easy with the compass that Zach carried. They sat there for a minute when they heard a rustling in the trees. They all went on high alert. "What the hell was that?" Zach said. They all went into defensive mode and listened closely. These woods had been littered with mountain lions, but they generally would leave a group alone. That's when they heard a growl. It started low, but then proceeded to grow higher. They all freaked out. Harold was no longer tired, but had an extreme amount of adrenaline. The noise was coming from near the trail they exited, so they all fled somewhat aimlessly in their westbound route. They heard rustling in the trees above them as they ran, but the forest was so thick and it was so dark at this point, not only due to nightfall, but due to the canopy created from this massive cluster of trees. After a few minutes of tripping on branches and cutting themselves on the sharp underbrush they were unable to avoid due to the speed they were going, they found a clearing. It was a ditch surrounded by 10-foot hills. It would provide them with some cover and comfort. Zach stopped and said, "Hey, we should be fine. I haven't heard anything in quite some time." Jess whimpered, "We should probably just leave." Anpu quickly interrupted, "It's probably safer to leave during the day. The sun will provide us with safety." At that, the group decided to make camp. Harold was seeing dots in his vision. He had pushed hard to make it out of those thick woods. Zach said, "I'm not making the tent for you. Me and Jess need some alone time." Zach winking at Jess. Anpu shot the two a very dirty look and proceeded to help Harold set up his tent. Anpu had done this many times, so it was quick and easy for him anyways. They all had a fire. Harold was so exhausted, he went to sleep first. By the fire, the remaining three sat. Jess stated, "I'm tired," winking at Zach and pinching him on the thigh. At this, Anpu rolled his eyes. He put his tent as far away from theirs on purpose, to avoid their nonsense. After the two of them went to bed, Anpu was looking up at the stars, when he saw a set of yellow glowing eyes in the trees from the direction they had come from. Anpu had stared at them intently for quite a while, just frozen. He continued to stoke the fire and figured it wasn't worth waking the rest of the crew. Eventually the eyes seeped back into the forest, most likely scared off by the roaring fire. The next morning, when they all woke up, Harold and Zach didn't want to leave. "This is my last chance to enjoy the woods. We knew the risks coming in here. Aren't you a man, Zach?" Harold would say, this knowing it played off Zach's macho man routine. To this Zach stated, "A man never runs." But Anpu could see the fear in his eyes. Jessica whined about how she didn't want to stay, but she was outnumbered 3-1. So they decided to stick it out in their clearing. They all set off on a hike. Zach had a compass in hand, Jess her phone, which was pointless because there wasn't service for miles. Anpu had a walking stick and was helping Harold traverse the unforgiving land. Harold was grateful and remained with a semi-forced smile on his face, enjoying what he could. Zach and Jess ran over to a large drop-off to a very rocky river. When Anpu and Harold caught up to them, Zach was joking with Jess slightly nudging her towards the edge. Jess was screaming, telling him to stop messing around. Harold was struck with the beauty of the edge and seemed to have gazed into the stream while the others conversed. After some time, they returned to camp and cooked some of their MREs that they had brought with them. By this time, the sun was just starting to set. Tired from yesterday and his demise, Harold said, "Time for me to kick the bucket." Anpu gave him a hug and said, "Sleep well, my friend." Zach snickered and called Anpu queer for hugging him, to which Jess giggled. Anpu shot them both a dirty look and went off to his tent. Zach and Jess proceeded to drink and stoke the fire, not letting the two others going to bed ruin their good time. Jess eventually got a stomachache, apologized to Zach for ruining the fun, and went off to bed. Zach was aggravated, but figured he wouldn't let this ruin his good time. He sat there for about half an hour and retired to camp himself. About an hour later, in the dead of night, Zach heard rustling around the campsite. He tried to wake Jess, but she was dead asleep, and shooed him away. With her queasy stomach, she was unwilling to move. He opened the tent to see the camp surrounded. It was dark and the fire was still going. If you've ever been near a fire in the woods, it does illuminate the surrounding area, but leaves no visibility outside of that area. He could make out what looked like cat's eyes surrounding in 360 degrees on the hill that they were centered in. Yellow, red, orange eyes all peering down on him. He yelled for the others and quickly ran towards Harold's tent, but he was gone. When he got to Anpu's tent, he was sound asleep. He shook him awake, telling him what was going on, but the two peered outside of the tent, but nothing was there. Anpu stated, "Very funny. I'm going back to bed." Zach told him, "I'm not kidding. I saw them surrounding us, and Harold's missing." Anpu responded, "Oh God." The two patrolled the surrounding area, but Anpu eventually said, "We will get lost if we go searching at this hour. We will continue in the morning." Zach stated, "What if they come back?" To which Anpu replied, "Well, stoke the fire. The mountain lions won't come near it. Plus, hopefully Harold sees us and finds his way back. He probably went to the bathroom. I'm going to get some rest. After you add some wood to the fire, I recommend you do too." Zach ended up staying awake the rest of the night, drenched with fear, making the fire as big as possible. The following morning, Zach and Jess wanted to leave. Zach, sure of what he saw last night, said, "Either we leave now, or me and Jess leaves. We can't risk another night out here." At this, Anpu felt his hand was forced and went to go see if Harold was back in his tent. But Harold wasn't there. He yelled to Zach and Jess to come over and look at what he was seeing. On his bed, open to a page nearing the end of the book. It was written by Harold. Anpu read it out loud. It was dated yesterday, time-stamped when he decided to lay down. "Today was a great day. I got to see the most beautiful sights with my friends and couldn't help but to feel I was lucky to have lived as long as I did. Over the last year, I got to experience my body falling apart and many painful and unforgiving treatments. But with that came the love of my friends and seeing some truly great things in life. Zach and Jess, you both are a massive pain, but I know you both mean well and I will miss you both dearly. Anpu, you were a great friend and helped me overcome these hurdles as if they were your own. When I saw that river, I knew I wanted to be there forever. Don't be sad about my passing. I will never forget the ending you all made possible." The group of three just sat there, struck by this note, as if it had punched them in the gut. They knew what they would see at the river, but they had to see if maybe he hadn't taken the plummet yet. It was a good few miles away from camp, and a good portion of the hike was through very unforgiving land. They assumed maybe Harold would still be on his way there or had decided not to make the jump. But by the time they got there, they found his red bandana sitting under a rock with Anpu's walking stick sitting over it. They tried to see if he was at the bottom of the cliff, hopefully alive, on the rocks, but nothing was there, just a rapidly flowing river. The group cried and started heading back. Jess tried to phone the authorities, but as usual in this heavily of a forested area, way off the trail, there was no reception. The group headed back to camp to go and grab their supplies. They decided going back to civilization from the cliff wasn't smart, because they didn't know what would lie due east of them on their way back. Ultimately, due to their broken spirits and being so tired from the last 2 days in those woods, they arrived back at camp when nightfall started. Anpu explained that there was nothing they could do for Harold, and although it was their duty to report this, there was no reason dying for it. They all decided to turn in early, Anpu now sleeping in his tent next to Zach and Jess's tent. That night, however, the howls started again, but this time coming from their west. But it sounded like many, many howls synchronized, starting low-pitched but ending with a high-pitched shriek. The three jolted to attention. They heard what sounded like a very delicate but quickly moving group of whatever these creatures were, bounding quickly for their camp. In their depression last night, none of them had stoked the fire and there was no time to rebuild. At this, the three started sprinting east into the woods, hoping they could outrun whatever this was, or at least hide in the thicket. Anpu, having been a runner, vaulted and sprinted forwards faster than Zach and Jess. If it weren't for the dire circumstances, they would have been impressed, but instead Zach yelled to him, "Come back, you coward, help us!" Jess had tripped on a root and sprained her ankle bad. Hearing the creatures howling and bounding closer to them, Zach said, "I'm sorry, babe," and just started sprinting to the east. Jess screamed for Zach to come back, but there was no response. She went for her phone, but it was gone. She knew she had it last night, but she no longer did. Zach heard her from far away. "Zach! Zach! Please, Zach!" Her speech was cut short, and Zach just kept running. Out of fear and confusion, he lost his direction and reached for his compass, but it was gone. He could have sworn it was in his pocket, but alas, it was not. At this, he didn't know what to do. He decided to backtrack to Jess and try and see if she had her phone still, knowing this was his only hope to find his way back. When he rounded the trees that he knew were the ones he left her at, his eyes widened. There he saw Anpu sitting over Jess's body. She had a hole in her chest and wasn't moving. He said, "Anpu, what happened? I saw you in front of us. Why are you here?" Anpu looked up. Zach could see the blood running down his chin. Anpu's teeth were razor sharp, his eyes blood red. Zach started backing up when two human-like creatures dropped at least 100 feet down and grabbed both of his arms, holding him back. It was as if they had claws. The more he struggled, the harder their claws dug in. At this, he stopped fighting and looked at Anpu. Anpu's veins were bulging, like a bodybuilder's does, and he looked like he threw on 20 pounds of muscle overnight. His hands open on either side of his body, with razor-sharp claws protruding from the tips of his fingers. "What the hell are you?" Zach screamed. With an evil-looking demeanor, Anpu said while staring at Jess's lifeless body, "Watch your tone and seal your mouth, young boy." Zach was equally as puzzled as he was in pain from the claws digging into his skin. "You see," said Anpu, "my name is Anubis. I was named after the god of death. My people," he gestured to the creatures behind him holding him back, "have been here for thousands of years. Well, not here but traversing the lands." Zach yelled, "What the Enough!" said Anubis. I have heard enough from you and will tolerate nothing but silence. My people were being tortured by the great floods and desperately needed harvest back. In ancient Egypt, 1378, in the Common Era, my people were praying to the great Sphinx of Giza to stop the floods and bring harvest back. A foolish man named Muhammad Saim al-Dir had been stupid enough to try and destroy our beloved Sphinx. We sentenced him to death. Zack was trembling but unable to move, not just because of being bound, but scared of what was to come next. Anubis continued. After this, we continued to pray to our great gods. Anubis had visited us to take Al-Dahir's heart in his hand and weigh it against a feather. The man was impure and deserved his fate. He bestowed upon us a curse to solve our problems. We no longer needed food, we needed flesh. By offering him the hearts of evil mortals, it would generate the immortality of the great Sphinx inside of us, and give us her beautiful intelligence. Anubis then blessed us with immense strength and agility that he had personally held. As long as we continued his sacrifice, we would live on, never hungry again. Anpu then tore a fresh piece of flesh from Jess with his teeth effortlessly. He then crushed Jessica's arm and ripped it clear off as if it was nothing and dropped it to the ground while standing up. You see, we target the most despicable humans. You mortals are so worthless. Zack screamed out, You can't do this, you're crazy! He tried to move, but the two holding him crushed his arms with ease. Zack bellowed out with great pain, This is your last warning, silence! Anpu gestured behind him to come. We aren't monsters, we save those of pure thought. Harold came out of the shadows, holding an ancient scale. Sorry, Zack, Harold would say, eyes to the ground, salivating, looking at Jess. Anpu explained, We performed the rituals on Harold. I read his diary yesterday, and I realized that he was pure of heart, and that he deserved to be one of us. You can't do that! Anubis bounded towards Zack at an incredible speed, leaping right in front of him, latching onto his throat and tearing it from his body before he could finish the sentence. Zack gargled, trying to breathe, but it was no use. I told you to be quiet. Zack's head started to bob, but the creatures behind him grabbed his head and held it up. Anpu proceeded to tear his heart straight from his chest and place it on the scale. It's said that you can stay conscious for quite some time after your heart is removed. On one side of the scale, Zack's heart. On the other, a feather glowing with a yellow light. Anpu smirked and said, I knew it. The scales did not tip in Zack's favor. This was followed by Anpu saying, Feast, my people. Let their blood flow upon you. The second last thing Zack saw was a stampede of these creatures bounding towards them on all fours, pulling and jumping their way through the trees. Anpu stated, Come, mother, father. He's finished. The two creatures dropped Zack to the floor. He looked up, seeing the two people who had him over for dinner many times through the last year, walking towards Jess's lifeless body. Zack starts blacking out, his eyes staring upwards as he gave his last attempt at a failed breath. The last thing Zack would see is many of these ancient people leaping down from the trees above, tearing him limb from limb. It has been months since Anpu's family, Zack, Jessica, and Harold had gone missing. At a college hundreds of miles away, school was starting. Freshmen poured into the lunchroom, sitting down for their meals. Alan, a self-proclaimed bad boy, stood near the table of jocks, holding a young boy up by the shirt. He was teasing him and demanding he paid for his lunch. The young man, held up by the shirt, said, I'm sorry I stepped on your shoe. It was an accident, but I have no money with me. Just the lunch that I brought from home. At this, Alan grabbed his lunch from his hand, threw him back, and told him to leave if he knew what was good for him. He sat down to grab the bag of chips out of this boy's lunch, throwing the rest out, making sure the boy saw. The table laughed and talked about their upcoming trip. In walks a freshman who was clearly in good shape, wearing a sports jacket. He sat down at the table and laughed, saying, Happy you gave that kid what he deserved. I'm your new quarterback. Can't wait for our upcoming trip. Alan looked over and sized this man up, but he liked his demeanor. Pleased to meet you. He punched the new guy in the shoulder. The name's Alan. The freshman replied, Pleasure's all my own. My name's Anpu. Another young man walked in and sat down next to Anpu. And this is my brother Harold.
Veteran police officer Gilbert rolled onto the scene of what was to be the darkest thing to happen in a rural town in Kansas. Accompanied by Gilbert was Officer Gonzalez, a recruit stretching their legs for the first time. Quite the call today, Rook. It may be the worst of my career, Gilbert stated, while focused on pulling into the long driveway of the crime scene. Police cars filled the lot, more than Gilbert had ever seen in one area of this quaint little town. Gonzalez was uncomfortable. His father had been an officer in Detroit. His father had seen many things in his life, and his father was also diagnosed with PTSD. Gonzalez's father had told him to not become an officer, but it was his dream since he was a child. When he moved out to this town, he figured he could fulfill his lifelong dream, while honoring his father's final wishes to not become the closed-off shell of a man he had been. While getting out of the car, Gonzalez was shell-shocked. The house was large. Placed on a huge field of corn, this farmland was clearly the work of generations. But what shook Gonzalez was the giant bay window centered in front of the home. It was blood red, splattered with what he could only assume was human remains. When walking inside, he was quickly pulled back by Gilbert. "Look where you step, Rook. The scene is very fragile." Gonzalez looked down to see drag marks going towards the living room of the house, where the bay windows were. Once inside, carefully stepping past the lines of smeared blood, Gonzalez had to hold back his vomit. The living room had blood splatters on the ceiling, all over the furniture, and even worse were the remains of those who once lived there. As detectives analyzed the scene, he could overhear their conversation. "Looks like we have 3 victims. The husband was shot in the head, it seems, as behind him there appears to be a bullet hole in the bay window. Looks like after he was shot, whomever shot him repeatedly bashed his skull in." Gonzalez looked down to what he could only explain as a mangled silhouette of a human. All of his limbs were completely bashed in, as if the killer had such a sense of overkill they could not help themselves. Gonzalez then looked to the couch and almost fell to his knees. There lay a child, with the same fate as the husband, the poor little body just as mangled. Gonzalez almost quit right on the spot, but Officer Gilbert could sense his loss of innocence in that moment. "I know this is a horrible sight to see, son. In my years, I have seen many things, and although this may top most of them, you can help us make sure this never happens to another child again." At that, Gonzalez regained his strength, knowing that he can make a difference in the next potential victim's life. Scanning the room, there was one more victim in this ordeal. A woman lay on the ground, her eyes blown out of her skull, but she had no other damage on her. She was covered in blood. "Why was she spared?" Gonzalez asked one of the crime scene investigators. The investigator looked at her, then back at Gonzalez. "From what I gather, it may have been pity, but what I can't understand is why it looks like her eyes were blown out from the inside of her head. And then there's that." The investigator then pointed at the woman's feet. There lay a cardboard box. It looked as if it was once tied by rope, however the rope was unbound. There was something peculiar about this box. It was clean, like unnaturally clean. In a room covered with blood, this box looked relatively untouched. One of the investigators picked it up and looked inside, his thick latex gloves rubbing against the rope to see that it was adhered to the side of the box, as if it was not meant to be opened. When peering inside, there was nothing. Gilbert was puzzled, but figured it may have been a signature from the killer. What it meant, nobody knew, but they bagged the box as many other things from the scene. Next to the box was a fire poker from the fireplace. The strong metal, almost dented, covered in every form of human viscera imaginable. Gonzalez stated, "Looks like that may have been the weapon." The investigators agreed, as it looked like the striations on the victims had many straight indentations. Gilbert stated, "You boys keep up the good work. I need a smoke and to think about what I have just seen." The investigators tipped their hats to Gilbert and Gonzalez as they walked out of the house. While walking out of the house, Gilbert said, "Rook, I know this must be too much to handle for you, as it is for me. Let's go back to base with what we have bagged, and start combing over what we know to generate some leads." Gonzalez had no qualms. He was just as ready to get out of there. Once at base, Gilbert and Gonzalez unloaded all they had collected. After a few hours of deliberation, they had both decided that they did not have enough to go on with their level of expertise. As they did not have any DNA analysis completed yet, it seemed that their best bet was to get some rest and work hard in the morning to combat whatever was going on here. Gilbert gave Gonzalez a ride home. They both went to grab a bite to eat, but it seems that their appetite was gone, for quite obvious reasons. As Gonzalez and Gilbert made their way through the dark woods on their way to Gonzalez's home, Gonzalez had memories of just a few years ago. He had just proposed to his now wife. As their wedding was approaching, his father had come down with a rare form of leukemia, and on his deathbed, he knew his son was in school to become an investigator, but he warned his son to turn away if it started to damage his soul. After he passed, Gonzalez, his new wife, and his mother moved out to Kansas to start a life in a much safer place to be a cop. When getting out of the car at Gonzalez's home, Gilbert got out to shake Gonzalez's hand. Gilbert was a tall, strong man. Lines of gray speckled his hair. Gonzalez was of the newer generation, one that was not built for such high levels of disaster as they had seen this very day. Instead of shaking Gilbert's hand, he hugged him. At first, Gilbert did not embrace him, but he too had seen too much for one to see in his life, so he hugged Gonzalez back and said, "That's enough, Snowflake." Gonzalez laughed, but then noticed in the back of the car, the box was still in the back seat. "Oh crap," Gonzalez stated. "What?" Gilbert said. Gonzalez then said, "We forgot to bring the box inside earlier." As he stated this, Gonzalez went to grab the box. "I think we should put it in the trunk, to make sure we don't damage it." "Good idea, rookie," Gilbert said. Gonzalez went and grabbed the box. When he did, he noticed the bag had become torn, most likely from the many items that they had taken out of the car earlier. Touching the box, Gonzalez was beside himself. "Oh shit, I'm so sorry, Gilbert. I think I touched it." "Don't worry," Gilbert stated. "The car has cameras in it. We know where you touched it. These things happen." Relieved, Gonzalez proceeded to put the box inside of the trunk. Gilbert waved to Gonzalez as he went inside his home. Upon entering his home, Gonzalez was relieved to be in a place that he felt safe in. Walking inside, he looked to his left, put his keys down next to his father's picture and urn. He picked up the picture and almost cried, knowing that he already was understanding his father's pain for so many years. He gently caressed the urn. Speaking softly, he said, "I will make sure to do you proud. This bastard will get caught." Gonzalez then proceeded to the right. His mother was in the living room as he ventured inside. He kissed her gently on the cheek and said, "Ma, it's late. You should head to bed." She did not respond. After his father died, she had come down with a case of dementia. It seemed as if it progressed over the years, violently. Gonzalez sighed and turned off the TV, covered his mother in a blanket, and reclined her chair. "Good night, Ma," he stated. "Good night, Earl," she said. Gonzalez almost cried when he had heard that. That was his father's name. As a good son, he responded, "Good night, dear," as his father would have. He walked upstairs to see his wife was asleep. Next to her, a bucket, as she had been having some serious morning sickness ever since becoming pregnant. He cleaned the bucket and put it back next to his wife. Trying to not wake her, and still in uniform, he climbed into bed. Between the mental and physical anguishes of the day, he just wanted to rest. As he slept, he kept dreaming of the crime scene, the sight of the box in the middle of the room constantly flashing across his mind. He awoke in the middle of the night in a panic, but quickly calmed himself so he could get some sleep for the long day to come. The very next day at the station, the police chief called a meeting. While addressing and breaking down the news of the day before, he had a harsh tone to his voice. Near the end of the meeting, he said, "We are not sure why, but the patrol car registered to Gibson is gone. This is not like him, so we went to his house this morning. We did not see a sign of him there." The lab tech then stated, "Last night Gibson said he was going to drive Gonzalez home." "Perry," Chief stated. Officer Perry, the other vet of the department, said, "Yes, sir." The chief then said, "Please go to Gonzalez's home to see if you can get to the bottom of this." "You got it, sir," Perry replied. Meanwhile, Gonzalez awoke from his slumber. He was exhausted from the various nightmares, and he awoke groggy. His wife still next to him in bed. He quietly got out of bed. Trying not to make noise, he immediately walked out of the room. He walked downstairs to make a pot of coffee and start his day right. That's when he saw in the middle of the room, on the table, was the box. The very same one from the crime scene. Gonzalez stared at it, puzzled for a moment, before he noticed that his feet felt as if his skin was stiff. He peered down to see he was covered in dried blood. At first panicked, he started hyperventilating. "I have to be dreaming," he said to himself. He pinched his arm, but it hurt. He tried to wake himself, but he slowly realized he may be awake. Freaking out, he ran for the front door to see if the world around him seemed as real as it should. When he was walking outside, he noticed the patrol car was still there. Puzzled, he then said, "Now I know I'm dreaming." He walked up to the patrol car. The trunk was open on the old Crown Vic, and he peered around the corner of the car. He saw Gilbert was bent over looking into the trunk. He assumed Gilbert may have been there to pick him up if this really wasn't a dream. "Gilbert!" Gonzalez screamed, but there was no response. As he approached the car, he noticed something horrible. There was a puddle of blood at Gilbert's feet, and Gilbert was covered in blood. So was the roof of the open trunk. It looked as if someone had slammed it upon him so many times that it looked like he was cut in half. Freaking out, Gonzalez ran back inside. Looking to the left, he saw his father's picture on the floor, crushed as if someone had thrown it on the ground and then stepped on it. His father's urn was missing. He quickly ran over to the sofa where his mother lay, completely decimated, with his father's urn sticking halfway out of her demolished face. Gonzalez screamed, half believing this to be a dream that was fostered by what he had seen the day prior. He ran upstairs, screaming his wife's name, "Eliza! Eliza!" When he reached the room, he expected to see his fearful wife sitting up in bed, but there she was, still lying down. He rushed to her side. When he saw it, the sheets, the bed, the blanket was covered in blood. He pulled the blankets off of her to find that her stomach had been hit so many times it looked as if it was caved in. Gonzalez was beside himself. Falling to the floor, he lay there crying, screaming, and not knowing what to do next. That's when he heard a siren outside, followed by the police intercom. "Gonzalez, are you in there?" Officer Perry's worried voice relayed over the loudspeaker. Gonzalez did not know what to do. As time went on, everything felt more and more real. That's when it clicked. He had touched the box. He had gone to the trunk with Gilbert. He had picked up his father's photo. He had touched his father's urn. He had tucked his mother in, and he had cleaned up after his wife. Slowly, he tried to make sense of the situation. He pulled up the doorbell camera that he had installed outside of his house. He then saw when he and Gilbert had pulled into the driveway, watching himself grab the box out of the patrol car. After that, he saw himself and Gilbert approach the trunk, where he slammed the trunk repeatedly on Gilbert, as Gilbert peered inside of the trunk. Frantic, he pulled up the nanny camera that he had watching over his mother. He watched as he walked inside, threw the picture of his father to the ground, and watched as he picked up his father's urn and proceeded to beat his mother to death with it. Gonzalez cried as he pulled up the third and final camera, the baby camera that he had set up in his room in preparation for his future child. He watched as he walked into the room and proceeded to continuously beat his wife with the bedside bucket over and over again. It all made sense. The second he touched the box, it was as if he was a different person. It was the box, the very same box that he had found at the crime scene. He felt as if it may have something to do with all that is going on. Gonzalez then asked himself, why? Why was the investigator not put into a trance-like state, as he was? Why was he not thrown into a fit of rage when he had touched the box? Gonzalez then remembered nobody had touched the box with their bare hands, except for him. Gonzalez, then rushing downstairs frantically and out of his mind, threw gloves on and grabbed the box with his now protected hands. Gonzalez then ran outside with the box. Perry yelled, "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know," Gonzalez yelled back, clenching the box tight. "Stay there," Perry stated, while growing increasingly nervous as he drew his gun. "It's the box. It's all been the box," Gonzalez said. "What the hell are you talking about?" Perry stated, confused. Gonzalez replied while lifting the box into the air, "I need to destroy it. I need to make sure." That's when Gonzalez felt moisture pouring down his face, as if he was crying, but he wasn't. He felt his face under his eyes, raising his hand in front of him. It was blood. He screamed as he once again raised the box to the sky. Feeling immense pressure, his eyes then burst straight out of his head. I would like to say thank you if you did reach the end of the story. I do very much enjoy writing and reading these, and I apologize that it's been a very long time since my last upload. With a family and trying to support them, I rarely find the time to be able to do this, and I would love to be able to do this every day if I was able to do so. So your like and your shares and especially your comments mean the world to me, and one day, hopefully, they help me propel myself to the level where I can do this on a daily basis.